Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. The trail wasn't on any map. That should have been the first warning. Rachel found it, tracing the contours of a faded, decades-old hiker's guide she'd bought at a roadside antique store. A thin, unlabeled path wound off the main route, deeper into the woods, marked only by a faint symbol, a spiral etched in the margin. A shortcut, she'd said. Though to where, none of them knew. Nathan led the way, machete in hand, hacking through overgrown brush. The deeper they went, the more the world changed. The trees were taller here, twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark slick and glistening as if wet. The air smelled thick, earthy, metallic, almost like blood. Chris, ever the skeptic, exhaled loudly. "We're going in circles." "No, we're not," Rachel shot back. "The map..." Her words faltered as the forest thinned, opening to a small clearing. In its center stood a stone well, old beyond reckoning. Its surface was covered in strange, curling inscriptions, their meaning lost to time. Thick moss climbed its sides, tendrils curling over the edge like fingers reaching inside. The well's mouth was wide and dark, an abyss swallowing the late afternoon light. A silence settled over the group, unnatural in its depth. No birds, no wind, just the five of them and the well. Lillian shivered. "This place feels wrong," Mark snorted. "It's just a well. People used to build these all the time." He ran a hand along the stone. "Probably dried up decades ago." Rachel was already snapping pictures. "It's incredible. There's nothing about it online. No records, no history." Chris peered into the void. "Anyone got a flashlight?" Nathan dug into his pack, pulled one out, and flicked it on. He shined the beam downward, but the light seemed to vanish before touching anything solid. No water, no bottom, just an endless, swallowing black. A strange pressure built in the air, as if the trees themselves were leaning in, watching. Chris shrugged. "Guess we found our mystery." Nathan, ever the daring one, grinned and dug into his pocket. He pulled out a quarter, holding it up between his fingers. "One way to find out if it's really bottomless." He flicked it into the darkness. No splash, no sound, just silence. And then, as they turned to leave, something echoed from the depths. A clink, not the sound of a coin hitting stone, the sound of something catching it. Nathan froze, his fingers still curled from where he had tossed the coin. The sound echoed in the well's throat, reverberating like a thing alive. A metallic clink, faint, deliberate, not the sharp ping of metal on rock, more like fingers closing around it. Chris exhaled sharply. "What the hell was that?" No one spoke. The air was thick, pressing down on them like a damp cloth. Nathan forced a laugh, though it came out weaker than intended. "Echo, maybe?" Rachel stepped forward, phone raised, recording. "No way. That was something catching it." Mark rolled his eyes. "Jesus, you guys are acting like we found the fucking Ark of the Covenant. It's a well. Sound travels weird in enclosed spaces. Let's move on." But Chris, always the first to poke fun at superstition, suddenly grinned. "All right, if it's just an echo, let's test it." He dug into his pocket, pulled out a nickel, and held it up like an offering. "How about this? I wish I had a cold beer." He flicked the coin into the well. Silence. Then a second clink. Rachel gasped. "No way." Chris turned, smug. "See, just a trick of the acoustics." He slung his pack off his shoulders and unzipped the main compartment. "Now, if I really had a..." His words cut off. His hand emerged holding a single ice-cold can of beer. His face drained of color. He hadn't packed beer. He knew he hadn't packed beer. The others gathered around as he held it up. Beads of condensation ran down its aluminum surface, untouched by the afternoon heat. He turned it over in his hands. his breathing unsteady. "This isn't funny," he said. "Who put this in my bag?" No one answered. Lillian took a step back. "Guys, something is wrong." Nathan, ever the adrenaline junkie, snatched the beer from Chris's hands, cracked it open, and took a swig. His eyes widened. "It's real." He turned the can to show them. "Chris, this is your favorite brand." Chris didn't respond. His mouth was slightly open, his fingers twitching at his sides. Rachel, unable to resist, stepped forward and peered into the well's dark throat. "What are you?" she murmured. The carvings on the stone shimmered under the dying sunlight, twisting in ways that made her stomach clench. A nervous, buzzing energy spread among them. Fear, yes, but something else too. Possibility. Chris licked his lips. No way, no fucking way. But his fingers itched for another coin. Nathan smirked, already reaching into his pocket. The well had given them something. Now it was time to see how far they could push it. By the time the sun bled into the horizon, they had all made a wish. It started with small things. Nathan, emboldened by Chris's beer, flipped a coin into the well and whispered, "I wish for $100. Moments later, he dug into his backpack and pulled out a crisp stack of 20s, bound by a faded bank slip. Rachel went next. "I wish for my ex to message me," she said, tossing in a dime. Minutes later, her phone buzzed. She stared at the screen, her breath hitching. A text from Dylan. The same Dylan who had ignored her for over a year. "Hey, I miss you, thinking about you." Mark and Lillian hesitated, but their resistance crumbled beneath the electric thrill surging through the group. Mark, ever the athlete, wished to be stronger. "Like really strong," he added, before flipping a quarter into the abyss. Almost immediately, he flexed his arms and let out a stunned laugh. "Holy shit," he muttered, rolling up his sleeve. His veins stood out, thick and pulsing, muscles swollen as if he had spent months at the gym overnight. Lillian's turn. She bit her lip, hand trembling as she held a penny. I wish my migraine would go away." She had suffered from chronic headaches since childhood, the kind that turned light into knives and sound into thunder. As soon as the coin vanished into the darkness, relief washed over her. The pain, the dull pressure behind her skull, gone. Just like that. They sat around the well, drunk on the rush of it, laughing like children with a secret they weren't supposed to know. The night deepened, shadows stretching long, curling toward them like fingers. But none of them cared. Chris held up another coin. "Guys, we could..." Nathan clapped a hand over his mouth. "Careful, don't get greedy." Rachel scoffed. "Says the guy rolling in $100? Chris grinned, still riding the high. "Fine, but tomorrow we come back, right? We see what else this thing can do." Silence settled over them, each lost in thought. The well had given them things, but it hadn't taken anything. Had it? Lillian shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should stop." Nathan rolled his eyes. "Lillian, come on, this is once-in-a-lifetime shit. We're fine." They weren't. That night, as they lay in their tents, each one of them dreamt of something watching from the well. Not a shape, not a person, just hunger. And somewhere deep in the woods, the carvings on the well began to shift. The morning came, but something was off. Chris woke up first, stretching with a groggy groan. His mouth was dry, tongue heavy. He smacked his lips, tasting something metallic like rust. With a yawn, he ran his tongue along his teeth, then stopped. Something shifted in his mouth. He reached up, prodding his gums, and felt something loose. His stomach lurched. Slowly, he pinched a tooth between his fingers and pulled. It wobbled. Another touch, another gentle tug. The tooth slid free like a piece of wet chalk. Chris bolted upright, spitting into his palm. A second tooth dropped out, slick with blood. He gasped, his breath turning shallow. The others stirred at the sound of him scrambling out of the tent, tripping over the zipper as he clawed his way to the clearing. Rachel sat up groggily. "Chris?" Chris was kneeling by the dying embers of the fire, his back hunched. His breath came in ragged, wheezing bursts. Nathan approached cautiously. "Dude, what?" Chris turned his head. His lips were smeared with blood, and in his trembling hands were 3 of his own teeth. A stunned silence fell over them. Chris swallowed hard. "They just fell out." His voice was tight, afraid. "What the hell is happening?" Lillian pressed a hand over her mouth, her face pale. "It took something," Nathan scoffed. "Don't start that shit." "Then explain this," Chris snapped, shaking his hand, blood spattering the ground. "I made a wish, and now this?" Rachel scrambled for her phone, scrolling frantically through last night's texts. "Dylan's messages are gone," she whispered, "like they never existed." She tried calling, but the number was disconnected. Mark rolled his shoulders, rubbing his biceps. "Maybe it's nothing. I mean, it's probably a coincidence, right?" But as soon as he said it, a sharp pop sounded from his wrist. He winced, gripping his arm. "What the?" His skin twitched. His veins bulged unnaturally, his muscles shifting beneath his flesh like something was rearranging. His jaw clenched, his knuckles cracking. He took a shuddering breath. "Okay, not a coincidence." Nathan turned to Lillian, desperate. "You wished for your migraine to be gone, right? Are you okay?" Lillian didn't answer at first. Then, in a small voice, "I can't remember what my mom's face looks like." The words hung heavy between them. The well had given them gifts. Now it was collecting its price. The morning air had changed, thicker, heavier, as if the well had exhaled something into the world. Chris sat apart from the others, clutching his own teeth like relics from a nightmare. He hadn't spoken since they'd tried to reason with him, since they'd tried to tell him it wasn't real. But they all knew better now. Mark kept flexing his fingers, rolling his wrists, watching the way his veins bulged beneath his skin, pulsing too hard, too fast. Every few minutes, a new muscle would seize up, hardening into something grotesque before relaxing again. Something inside him was changing. Rachel, pacing, kept muttering, "It's just stress, just stress. Maybe we got into some weird plant or fungus or—" "You really believe that?" Lillian snapped, her voice tight with controlled panic. "My memories are missing. They're just gone." She dug her fingers into her scalp, as if trying to press something back in. "I know I had a brother, but I can't remember his voice, his name, his face." Her breathing hitched. "I can't even remember what I forgot." Nathan stood by the well, hands on his hips, staring into the abyss. "Maybe we just need to ask for it back." Chris let out a wet laugh, spitting blood. "You want to go bargain with it? Be my guest." Nathan ignored him, pulling a handful of coins from his pocket. He hesitated for only a moment before tossing them in. Clink, clink, clink. "I want Chris's teeth back," he said firmly, "and Lillian's memories." Silence. The well yawned before them, its black throat swallowing the sound. Then, clink. A coin landed back at Nathan's feet. The group froze, no wind, no movement. The well had returned his offering, a refusal. Rachel took a step back. "It doesn't do take-backs." A sound drifted up from below, not a voice, not even a whisper, just movement. Wet, heavy, like something shifting against stone. Chris stood, his body trembling. "We need to get the hell out of here." Nathan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. Agreed. They gathered their things in frantic silence, stuffing sleeping bags into packs, tearing down their tents with shaking hands. Then Rachel gasped, "Where's Mark?" They spun, looking around the clearing. The trail leading out of the woods was empty. No footprints, no sound. And then they saw it. Mark's boot resting at the edge of the well. One boot. Just that. And nothing else. Rachel was the first to move, lunging toward the well's edge. Nathan grabbed her arm, yanking her back before she could get too close. "Don't," he warned. His voice was low, urgent. "Whatever's down there, it took him." Rachel wrenched free, panic wild in her eyes. "Mark!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She cupped her hands around her mouth, peering into the well's gaping throat. "Mark, can you hear me?" No answer. Chris staggered closer, eyes darting to the discarded boot. It lay there like a severed limb, the laces untied, the leather still warm from Mark's body heat. Lillian whimpered. "He was right here. He was—" She broke off with a choked sound, one hand pressing against her temple. Her pupils flickered, unfocused. I can't," she gasped, eyes filling with tears. "I don't remember his face." Rachel froze, breath hitching. "What?" Lillian clutched at her head. "I know Mark. I know him, but I I don't remember what he looks like, his voice, anything. Nathan paled. That's not possible, but it was. Because as they stood there, cold dread creeping through them, the truth settled like a stone in their stomachs. Mark wasn't just gone, he was being erased. Rachel turned to Nathan, desperation cracking her voice. We have to get him back. Chris let out a harsh laugh. How? You saw what happened when Nathan tried to bargain. He pointed at the well. That thing doesn't give back, it only takes. Rachel's face twisted in frustration. We can't just leave him. Mark is already gone. Chris's voice was flat, but his hands were shaking. We need to leave before we're next. Nathan hesitated, but the look in Chris's eyes, the sheer fear, told him everything. We move, he said, grabbing his pack. Now. Rachel refused at first, lingering near the well, her gaze darting between the dark opening and Mark's lone boot. Her lips trembled. Then a sound rose from the depths, a deep, wet sigh. Not Mark, not human. Rachel bolted. They ran without looking back, feet pounding against the dirt. The trees around them felt closer, their trunks pressing in. The air thickened, humid and wrong, like breath against their skin. They didn't stop until they burst onto the main trail, gasping for air. Chris bent over, hands on his knees. We made it. Then Rachel whispered, Wait. They turned. The well. It was right behind them. They had run, but they hadn't left. Rachel's breath hitched as she stumbled backward, staring at the impossible sight before them. The well, its moss-covered stone lip and shifting carvings, sat just a few feet away, exactly where they had started. Nathan turned in a slow circle. No, we ran. His voice cracked. He pressed his fingers into his temples, his breathing uneven. Chris wheezed, dropping to his knees. This isn't real, he muttered. This can't be real. Lillian let out a strangled sob. We didn't move. We ran for miles and we're still here. The forest pulsed around them, ancient and watchful. The towering trees loomed impossibly high, their bark splitting in jagged patterns like jaws. The air was thick with decay, the scent of rotting wood, damp moss, and something sweet, something hungry. Rachel gritted her teeth, her hands curling into fists. We'll go again. Chris's laughter cut her off, harsh, bitter, unraveling at the edges. He held up his shaking hands, fingers smeared with blood from his missing teeth. And then what? We keep running, we keep trying. You think it's going to let us go? He turned wild, red-rimmed eyes on her. It wants us here. Nathan spun on him. Shut the hell up! But Chris wasn't listening. He was staring at the well, his lips trembled. I think I get it now, he whispered. The others froze. Chris! Lillian's voice was barely a breath. Chris swayed, eyes glazed, something pulling him toward the well like an invisible thread wrapped around his ribs. His lips moved, barely a whisper. We took too much. It wants balance. And then he was moving. Rachel lunged for him. Chris, no. But he was faster. Chris ran, his footsteps light, effortless, as though the ground itself was guiding him toward the well's hungry mouth. Nathan grabbed his arm, but the moment their skin touched, something cold rushed up Nathan's arm, numbing him from the inside. His grip loosened, his fingers sluggish, his own strength drained away. Chris turned, smiling through the blood in his mouth. It'll take us one by one. Then he pitched forward into the well's throat. No scream, no impact, just silence. Rachel staggered back, her breath hitching, hands shaking. No. A clink sounded from the well. Chris had made his wish, and now the well had claimed him. Chris was gone, not just fallen, taken. The well had swallowed him without a sound, and now its mouth sat wide and waiting, as if licking invisible lips, savoring the taste of what it had just consumed. Rachel turned away, bile rising in her throat. We have to leave. We have to. We tried, Lillian whispered, voice hollow, and it brought us back. Nathan ran, shaking hands through his hair, his breath coming in uneven bursts. Then we do something different. His eyes locked onto the well's opening. We find out what's inside. Rachel spun on him. Are you insane? We don't have a choice. Nathan's voice was strained, but there was a dark certainty in it. He pointed at the trees. Look around. The woods aren't normal. We could run for days and never leave. He hesitated, swallowing hard. Chris understood. The only way out is through. Lillian clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. You're saying we climb in? A long silence. Nathan exhaled sharply. Yes. Rachel shook her head. No, absolutely not. I'm not going down there. But Lillian was already moving. Before she could second-guess herself, she swung a leg over the stone lip of the well. It was warm, almost feverish against her palms. The second she touched it, the carvings beneath her hands shifted, writhing like living things. The moment she lowered herself inside, the air changed. It wasn't just cooler, it was thicker, syrupy and damp, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. The rope ladder along the inner wall was ancient, the fibers brittle, flaking away under her fingers. Nathan followed, his jaw tight, movement stiff with fear. Rachel cursed but climbed in after him. The descent felt endless. The deeper they went, the stranger the world became. The well's walls pulsed, moist and alive, the stone beneath their fingers rippling like flesh. The air was laced with a sickly sweetness, thick and cloying, a scent that made their stomachs churn. Rachel gagged. This isn't right. This isn't... Then the rope snapped. They plummeted. The world spun, gravity shifting, flipping them into freefall. Their screams were swallowed by the dark, the well stretching, expanding, turning inside out. Then they landed. The impact knocked the breath from their lungs, but it wasn't rock beneath them. It was something soft. Lillian rolled over, heart hammering. She reached out, fingers pressing into the ground. It was flesh. A cavern stretched before them, its walls lined with pulsating veins, the air thick with the scent of decay and something far worse. Something moved in the darkness. A voice echoed, low, many-voiced. More. Then the darkness breathed. The cavern breathed around them, a slow, rhythmic expansion, like the inhalation of something impossibly large. The walls twitched, a ripple of movement that sent a fresh wave of decay-laced air washing over them. Lillian gagged, pressing a hand over her mouth. Oh my God. Nathan turned in slow, disbelieving circles, his flashlight beam struggling to illuminate the vastness around them. The walls were not stone. They glistened, slick with moisture, a deep crimson hue that pulsed in time with an unseen heartbeat. Veins the width of tree roots snaked along the floor, disappearing into the shadows. And the floor. Rachel staggered back, her foot sinking slightly. She looked down. Hair. The ground was made of matted, tangled human hair. A low, wet voice slithered through the air. More. The three of them froze. Rachel's breath came in quick, shallow bursts. That wasn't an echo. Nathan's flashlight flickered. Something shifted at the far end of the cavern. A hulking, slithering mass that was neither flesh nor shadow, but somewhere in between. It unfolded, stretching toward them, many-limbed, many-mouthed, many-eyed. Chris was there, or what was left of him. His skin was part of the walls now, his face stretched unnaturally, his mouth open in a silent scream. His fingers twitched, embedded in the cavern like an insect trapped in amber. His eyes rolled toward them. Lillian choked back a sob. Oh, Chris, the voice laughed. It came from everywhere. You took, it whispered. You feasted. Now, the debt must be paid. Nathan clenched his fists. We never agreed to any of this. The cavern shuddered. A deep, grating hunger radiated through the air, more felt than heard. Then offer another, the voice hissed. Rachel's blood ran cold. What? The well must feed, it crooned. One of you must stay. The others may go. The three of them stood frozen. Lillian's fingers twitched at her sides. She looked between Nathan and Rachel, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Rachel shook her head, eyes wild. No, we are not playing this game. Nathan's voice was hoarse. It's a trick. It won't let any of us go. Perhaps, the voice sighed, but without a gift, you will all belong to me. Silence. Rachel trembled. There has to be another way. Lillian's gaze flickered to Chris, to the way his skin had fused with the walls, the way the well had claimed him. She took a step forward. Nathan grabbed her arm. Lillian, don't. But she was already reaching for the blade at her hip. I'll do it, she whispered. The cavern purred. Nathan lunged forward, grabbing Lillian's wrist before she could make the cut. No, we don't have to do this. She turned to him, her eyes hollow, her skin pale. Yes, we do. Her voice was eerily calm. It won't stop. It will keep taking. You saw what it did to Chris, to Mark. She swallowed hard. I won't let it take all of us. Rachel trembled beside them, her mind spinning. We can fight it, we can. But the thing in the cavern shifted, expanding, its many mouths grinning. Time is running out, it whispered, its voice vibrating inside their bones. Choose, or you all stay. Nathan tightened his grip on Lillian's arm, desperation in his eyes. There has to be another way. Lillian smiled, a sad, knowing smile. Then she yanked free. Before Nathan could react, she turned the knife inward. Rachel screamed. Nathan caught her as she collapsed, blood spilling between them warm and fast. Lillian gasped, shuddering as she fell to her knees. The cavern shuddered. The walls rippled. The well sighed in satisfaction. A deep rumble filled the space, and suddenly the air pulled inward. A great exhale before a final breath. The cavern walls convulsed, the flesh receding, the many mouths stretching wide in a soundless scream. The well was sated. Rachel clutched Lillian's face, sobbing. No, 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 you idiot, you stupid self-sacrificing. Lillian's lips parted, but no sound came. Her body twitched once, then went still. Nathan let out a shuddering breath, his throat raw. She did it, he whispered. The cavern was collapsing. The pulsing walls peeled away, the darkness unraveling around them. The ground beneath them trembled. And then they were falling. Nathan hit the ground first, hard. He gasped, choking on dust and cold air, his hands dug into dirt. Dirt, not flesh. Rachel landed beside him, coughing violently. They were back. The clearing, the trees, the well, but no Lillian. Nathan pushed himself up, his hands shaking. The well stood before them, its carvings still writhing, its moss-covered lip damp with something dark. Rachel sobbed, clutching her chest. She's gone. Nathan couldn't answer. His throat felt full, like something had lodged itself inside him. Guilt, grief, a debt unpaid. The well had taken what it wanted, for now. Rachel wiped her face, her fingers trembling. We're leaving. Nathan nodded numbly. They didn't look back. They never spoke about it again. But years later, in the quiet hours of the night, Nathan sometimes heard it. A whisper in the dark. Not a voice. Not even a sound. Just the feeling of something waiting. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the well still stood, its hunger never truly gone, waiting for the next fool to ask for more than they could afford to give. The train station loomed like the husk of something long abandoned, yet unwilling to decay. Graffiti marred the cracked brick walls, and weeds curled through gaps in the pavement like skeletal fingers. Josh adjusted his camera, scanning the empty tracks while Dave tested the microphone. "This place is dead," Dave muttered, panning his flashlight across the vacant platform. The light barely penetrated the suffocating darkness beyond the tracks. "Not for long," Josh murmured. According to the legend, the midnight train was a phantom, an impossibility. Those who saw it rarely spoke of what happened afterward. Some simply vanished. Others were found days later, lost in the city with no memory of how they got there, their eyes dark hollows. Josh and Dave had debunked dozens of ghost stories, but this one, it felt different. The air was wrong, thick, expectant. Even the streetlights bordering the station seemed hesitant, flickering in and out of existence. They set up their cameras, positioning them toward the rusted tracks. The silence stretched, the anticipation gnawing at Josh's ribs. Then, a distant whistle cut through the stillness. It didn't echo like a normal sound. It curled through the air, resonating deep in their bones. Josh's breath hitched. The tracks, empty just seconds ago, hummed as if something massive approached. "There's nothing there," Dave whispered, eyes locked on the empty rails. And then there was. The train appeared without arriving. 1 second, the station was empty. The next, a sleek metallic train stood waiting, dark windows gleaming beneath the flickering station lights. It wasn't old or rusted. It was pristine, impossibly clean, as if it had been polished for centuries, waiting for this moment. The doors hissed open. Josh exchanged a glance with Dave. This was the moment they were here for. If they hesitated, the train might disappear. If they hesitated, they might never get another chance. Dave exhaled sharply. "We doing this?" Josh nodded. He lifted his camera and stepped onto the train. The floor was cold beneath his boots, almost damp. A sickly sweet scent clung to the air like decayed flowers. Dave followed. As soon as his foot crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind them. The sound was final, like the slamming of a coffin lid. Josh turned, pressing his palms against the sealed doors. Dave?" Outside the windows, the station blurred, not as if the train was moving, but as if the world itself was unraveling. The tracks, the buildings, the sky, everything peeled away, leaving only a swirling void of absolute darkness. The train lurched forward, and there was no going back. Josh pressed against the doors, palms flat against the cold, metallic surface. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. "Try the emergency button," Dave said, voice tight. Josh's fingers fumbled for the panel near the door. The red button sat there, dusty, neglected. He pressed it, hard. Nothing. A hollow click, no alarm, no response. Dave tried the intercom. "Hello, anybody there? We just, need the doors to open. Now!" The speaker crackled to life. Static. Then, a click. Something was listening. Josh shuddered and turned away from the door. His breath came short and fast, as if the air in the train had thinned. The interior was disturbingly clean. No graffiti, no signs of past passengers. Just long rows of faded seats, the fabric peeling in places, shadows pooling beneath them like ink spilled from a nightmare. "Where's the conductor?" Dave asked, scanning the length of the car. Josh tried to steady his breathing. "Maybe in the next car?" His fingers trembled as he lifted his camera. The small red light flickered, recording every eerie detail. Outside the windows there was nothing. Not the city, not the station, not the world. Only blackness, churning like something alive. Josh's stomach twisted. He'd expected eerie, expected unsettling, not this. This wasn't just an abandoned train. This was a thing untethered from reality, moving through a space that wasn't supposed to exist. The floor beneath their feet trembled, as if something deep beneath them breathed. "Okay," Dave exhaled. "Okay, man, what do we do?" Josh turned to the door again, gripping the edges, pulling hard. The metal was ice cold, unyielding. It was as if the doors weren't locked, but welded shut by reality itself. The lights flickered overhead. Josh froze. The bulbs buzzed, throwing erratic shadows across the seats. And then, a new shadow flickered on the wall, not theirs. It stood in the aisle, just beyond their field of vision, long-limbed, head tilted, still, watching. The train gave another shudder, the sensation traveling through the floor and into their bones. Josh swallowed hard. "Dave?" Dave turned and froze. There was nothing there, just empty seats. And yet, Josh could still feel it, that presence, lurking, waiting, watching. The train wasn't just moving forward, it was waking up. Josh's grip on the camera tightened. The train car stretched out in front of them, row after row of empty seats, the dim yellow overhead lights casting weak halos across the dust-laden fabric. Dave took a slow step forward, the floor beneath him groaning softly. "We need to check the next car," he muttered. Josh nodded, forcing his feet to move. The sense of being watched gnawed at his nerves. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, his camera aimed down the aisle. The screen flickered for a moment, static crackling across the image before stabilizing. Then Dave cursed under his breath. Josh looked up. 3 rows ahead, a man sat slumped in one of the seats. He hadn't been there before. His posture was unnaturally stiff, hands folded neatly in his lap, head bowed, the brim of a dusty hat obscuring his face. His coat looked old, the fabric brittle, as if left in a closet for decades. Josh's breath hitched. Did you see him sit down?" Dave shook his head. Josh raised his camera again, zooming in. The figure remained motionless. The train rocked slightly and the seats creaked, except for his. "Hey, sir," Dave called hesitantly. "Are you okay?" No response. Dave took a slow step closer. Josh's pulse pounded against his skull. Something felt wrong. Not just the silence, not just the impossibility of the man's sudden appearance. It was the air, the way it seemed to warp around him like heat distortion on pavement. "Dave," another creak. Josh turned. A woman now sat 5 rows back, head turned slightly toward them. Her dress was old-fashioned, tattered at the edges. Long, stringy hair obscured her face. Josh's stomach twisted. She hadn't been there a second ago. Dave spun, his voice caught between a gasp and a curse. "They weren't." Josh blinked. And in that blink, the man had moved. No longer slumped. He was now 2 rows closer, his head still bowed. Another blink. The woman was closer, her hands resting lightly on her knees, fingers impossibly long. Josh refused to blink again. The lights overhead flickered, buzzing like insects trapped in glass. A low creak rippled through the seats, like bodies shifting all at once. Josh's hands trembled. The camera screen flickered again, distorting, warping. And then a shadow rose at the end of the car. Tall, gaunt, watching. The conductor had arrived. The shadow stretched impossibly long down the aisle, rippling across the faded seats like a living thing. Josh's stomach twisted as his camera flickered again, struggling to hold on to reality. At the far end of the car, the conductor stood waiting. His uniform was crisp, yet faded with time, the buttons gleaming dull bronze in the dim light. His frame was wrong, too thin, too elongated. The longer Josh stared, the more it seemed like the uniform was the only thing holding him together. His face, sunken, hollow, too wide. A lipless grin stretched impossibly across his face, exposing yellowed teeth that looked more like splinters than bone. His eyes, or the spaces where his eyes should be, were nothing but twin voids, deep and endless. The train lurched, sending a wave of nausea through Josh's stomach. He grabbed the nearest seat to steady himself, but Dave took a step back. The conductor didn't move, yet in the next flicker of the lights, he was closer. Josh sucked in a sharp breath. His fingers fumbled at his side, searching for his camera's zoom function. But the second he blinked, closer. The conductor now stood just a few feet away, his head tilted, the grin widening, though he made no sound. He simply watched. Then he raised one skeletal hand. Josh's chest tightened as he saw what the conductor held. 2 tickets. The slips of paper were thin, almost translucent, their edges fluttering despite the dead air inside the train. The symbols scrawled across them weren't in any known language, shifting as Josh's eyes tried to focus. Dave clenched his jaw. What happens if we don't take them? The conductor's grin did not falter. His arm remained extended, the tickets trembling between his fingers. Josh didn't want to find out what happened if they refused. His gut screamed at him to run, to find another way out, to escape before the train took them somewhere they could never return from. But his hand moved on its own, fingers brushing against the paper. As soon as he touched it, a piercing cold shot through his arm, sinking into his veins like ice. A rush of air filled his lungs, but it wasn't air at all. It was something else, something stolen. His breath weakened, his vision swam. He felt his pulse slow. The conductor reached for Dave. Dave jerked back, but it was too late. The conductor punched the ticket. A sharp snap of air, like something breaking. Josh gasped, clutching his chest. A piece of him had just been taken. The conductor pocketed the stubs, satisfied. His skeletal grin stretched further. Josh's ears rang. His body felt lighter, hollowed out, like a part of him had just ceased to exist. Then, the overhead screen flickered, the digital letters shifting between legible locations and jagged alien symbols. The train wasn't stopping. The PA system crackled to life. A voice, distorted and wrong, rasped through the speakers. "Next stop, forever." Josh clutched his chest, his breath still shallow from whatever the conductor had just taken. His limbs felt lighter, but not in a good way, like something essential had been pulled out of him, leaving only a fragile husk behind. Dave gripped his shoulder. "You okay, man?" Josh swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, I think so." It was a lie. He felt less. The conductor stepped back, his skeletal frame barely shifting as he melted into the flickering shadows. He had what he wanted. For now, Josh and Dave turned their attention to the overhead display, the screen jittering between locations. Union Station, Central Terminal, Nowhere, Forgotten Place, Never Left. Each name lasted only a moment before morphing into something else, as if the train couldn't decide where it was supposed to be. Josh clenched his fist, trying to steady himself. "This train isn't stopping, is it?" Dave exhaled sharply. "Nope." The intercom crackled again, the sound crawling beneath their skin. A voice, not quite human, spoke in a fractured whisper. "We see you." Josh's stomach twisted. The other passengers, the ones who had appeared out of nowhere, began to mutter. The man in the brimmed hat rocked forward slightly, his fingers twitching on his lap. His lips moved, forming words that Josh couldn't understand. The woman with the stringy hair let out a slow, wheezing breath, her head tilting ever so slightly. Their voices weren't distinct. They overlapped, bleeding into each other, forming an unnatural, rhythmic chant. It wasn't a language Josh recognized, but his body reacted to it. His stomach twisted, a deep nausea rolling through his bones. It felt like his mind was being stretched, reshaped. Dave covered his ears. "Josh, we have to move." Josh nodded, but his legs refused to cooperate at first. It felt like the air inside the train was thickening, pressing down on them, slowing them. The windows rattled. Josh glanced outside, expecting the same swirling darkness. But something had changed. The void was no longer empty. Shapes moved within it. At first they looked like shadows, featureless, shifting things. But then, one of them pressed against the glass. A hand, blackened and stretched too thin, dragged its fingers down the window pane. Another face surfaced, a reflection with no eyes, no mouth, just smooth nothingness staring straight at them. Josh took a step back. Dave cursed. "Screw this, man. We need to find another car." Josh nodded quickly. "Agreed." The muttering from the passengers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a grotesque harmony. The conductor remained where he was, his grin never faltering, his hands clasped behind his back as if he had all the time in the world. Dave grabbed Josh's sleeve and pulled him toward the sliding doors at the end of the train car. They didn't stop to check if anyone followed. Josh shoved the door, and it opened. The next car was pitch black. A single light flickered overhead, revealing something piled in the aisle. Josh's stomach dropped. They weren't alone in here. And the things left behind told them they weren't the first. Josh and Dave stepped cautiously into the darkened train car, their breaths shallow. The moment the door slid shut behind them, the sound of chanting from the previous car was abruptly cut off, replaced by silence. Not the comforting kind, the kind that carried weight, as if something unseen was holding its breath alongside them. Josh flicked on his camera's night vision. The screen flared green, revealing rows of abandoned belongings. Backpacks slumped against the seats, cell phones with shattered screens, jackets draped over armrests as if their owners had simply stepped away and never returned. Dave exhaled sharply. What the hell? Josh crouched near a dusty purse, nudging it open with one gloved hand. Inside, a driver's license peeked out, its photo faded, the name worn away by time. "This stuff's been here for years," Josh muttered. Dave reached down, picking up a cell phone half buried under an old duffel bag. The screen was cracked, but when he tapped it, it turned on. Josh's breath hitched. "That's not possible." The phone's lock screen showed a missed video call. The timestamp read 12 o'clock a.m., the exact time they had stepped onto the train. Then, without warning, the screen flickered and a video began playing. Josh and Dave leaned in. The footage was grainy, recorded in low light. It showed a man, sweaty, wild-eyed, staring into the camera. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Don't look at them. Don't speak to them. No matter what they do, no matter what they say." His words cut off as a shadow loomed behind him. Josh's stomach twisted. The figure wasn't human. Its shape rippled like smoke, eyes burning black voids. The man turned, his face contorted in horror. Then, the screen glitched. Static rippled across the display. For half a second, an image flashed. The same man, but now he was different. His eyes were gone. His skin had turned ashen and sunken. His mouth locked in a twisted grin. Then the screen cut to black. Josh and Dave stood frozen. The silence pressed in. Then the phone screen lit up again. A new video file appeared. Dave hesitated, then pressed play. The screen showed Josh and Dave, right here, in this train car. Josh's throat went dry. The footage showed them as they were now, standing amid the abandoned belongings, except in the recording. There was someone standing behind them. A shape loomed in the darkness, too tall, too thin. Its arms hung too long, its fingers brushing against Josh's shoulder. But he felt nothing. Dave whipped around. Nothing was there. The phone shut off on its own, plunging them back into silence. Josh exhaled shakily. We need to keep moving. Neither of them looked back as they hurried toward the next door. Behind them, a bag rustled, as if something had just moved inside it. Josh and Dave didn't look back as they forced the next door open. The hinges groaned like something in pain, resisting their escape. Beyond the threshold, the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, an endless corridor of glass lining both sides of the car. But outside there was no night sky, no station, no cityscape. At first the black void churned, as it had before. But then something changed. The darkness peeled away, revealing impossible places. Dave took a slow, shaky step forward. Josh barely heard him. His eyes were locked on the windows, on the new worlds rushing past them. To his left, a city of floating buildings loomed against an ashen sky. The structures were impossibly twisted, spirals of metal and bone fused together. In the streets below, figures walked, but they weren't normal. Their limbs were wrong, their movements unnatural. And then, as one, they looked up at him. Josh's breath caught in his throat. They weren't just looking through the window. They were aware of him. Their mouths unhinged in eerie synchronization, stretching wide as if screaming, but no sound came through the glass. Dave grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the opposite side. Don't look too long. Josh tore his eyes away, turning toward the right side windows, and wished he hadn't. The scene outside had changed. Now they were rushing through a barren wasteland, a desert stretching endlessly beneath a blood-red sky. Something moved in the sand, figures dragging themselves forward on elongated limbs. One of them lifted its head. Josh's legs nearly gave out. The creature's face was his own, not just similar, not just a look-alike. It was him, his own expression, his own eyes staring back. Except this version of him was hollow, starved, with skin pulled tight against bone. His other self reached out, fingers scraping against the invisible wall of the window. The train lurched. Josh stumbled back, tearing his gaze away. Dave's breathing was ragged. What the hell is this? Josh forced himself to look at one last window, and immediately wished he hadn't. They were now passing through a ruined landscape, a train yard filled with the wreckage of countless other trains, all burnt-out husks, their metal skeletons twisted into grotesque shapes. Beyond them something stirred, a colossal silhouette rising in the distance. Its eyes were hollow voids, its body shifting like something not meant to be seen. It watched them, and then it started moving toward the train. Josh's chest tightened. We have to go, now. They bolted for the next door, the echoes of their footfall swallowed by the humming of the train. As Josh reached for the handle, the windows behind them shattered inward. But not with glass, with hands. Josh and Dave shoved the door open, practically throwing themselves into the next train car. The hands, pale, blackened, wrong, had torn through the shattered windows behind them, reaching into the space they had just occupied. The moment they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut on its own. Josh twisted around, breath ragged. The glass was whole again. No broken shards, no hands clawing inward. Just an endless corridor of pristine windows, as if it had never happened. Dave swore under his breath, hands on his knees. I don't understand. Josh barely heard him. He was staring ahead into the new train car they had just entered. His stomach dropped. They had stepped back into the same train car, the one they had just left. Every detail was the same: the faded seats, the flickering overhead lights, the buzzing digital screen. The passengers were no longer scattered. They were all facing them now, every single one. The man with the brimmed hat, the woman in the tattered dress, and others they hadn't noticed before. They all sat in perfect silence, turned in unison, staring at Josh and Dave. And they were smiling. Dave's voice wavered. "Josh, please tell me you see that." Josh swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his throat. "I see it." Then, movement. Not from the seated figures, from the far end of the car. The door they had just come through was open again. And standing inside the doorway, looking in, were themselves. Josh and Dave. Not reflections, not tricks of the eye. They were watching themselves, frozen in the same terrified stance, their own faces staring back at them. Josh's stomach twisted violently. His other self, the duplicate Josh, blinked. He wasn't supposed to do that. And then, in perfect unison, the two versions of themselves at the other end of the car turned their heads slightly toward the passengers. A slow mechanical movement. Their lips curled into the same two wide smiles. Dave grabbed Josh's arm, his fingers ice cold. "Go." Josh didn't hesitate. They lunged for the next door. But their doppelgangers moved too. The other Josh and Dave mirrored them exactly, sprinting forward from the opposite side of the train car. The overhead screen flickered violently, the digital text morphing into something unreadable, before finally locking into place. Final destination. The conductor's laugh rumbled through the air, and from behind them, the passengers began to stand up. The passengers rose in eerie synchronization, their joints cracking like dried wood. Their smiles never faltered, eyes locked onto Josh and Dave as if they had been waiting for this moment. Josh ripped open the next door, yanking Dave through just as the other passengers lurched forward. The door slammed behind them, but this car was different. No seats, no windows, no flickering lights, just an endless black void stretching into infinity. Josh's breath hitched. It was not a train car anymore. It was something else, a corridor of darkness, pulsing like a living thing. Dave's grip on Josh's wrist tightened. "We're running out of places to go, man." Josh turned back toward the door, only to see their duplicates standing on the other side of the glass, grinning. His own eyes, his own face, but wrong. They weren't reflections. They were waiting. Then, a soft chime echoed from above. Josh's gaze snapped to the ceiling. A single emergency exit sign flickered red at the end of the void. A doorway barely visible in the gloom. Dave exhaled shakily. "That's gotta be it," a voice whispered behind them, smooth as oil. "Go on then, but remember." They spun. The conductor stood just behind them, his skeletal grin stretched too wide, his hollow eyes staring straight into them. The train always comes back for what belongs to it. Josh didn't wait. He grabbed Dave's arm, and they sprinted toward the glowing exit. The void beneath them shifted, its surface rippling like something breathing, but they kept running. The red glow of the exit pulsed, the words above it shifting between "step through if you dare" and "one way only." Dave reached it first. He hesitated for half a second, just long enough to see what lay beyond the door. A swirling abyss, a sensation of falling forever. No train tracks, no station, just nothing. Josh's heart slammed against his ribs. "We don't have a choice." The train rumbled violently, the sound distorted, like reality itself was tearing apart. Behind them, the conductor and their twisted duplicates were moving toward them, slow, patient, knowing they had no escape. Dave made the call. He jumped. Josh followed. For a single moment, as his feet left the floor, he felt the weightless terror of falling through nothingness. The train, the passengers, the conductor, everything warped around them. A violent snap. Then, Josh's eyes flew open. The train was gone. They were back. Josh gasped, his body jerking upright. His fingers clutched at something solid. A bench. The station. They were back. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, casting dull glows over the cracked pavement. The tracks were empty, stretching into the distance like they had never held anything at all. Dave sat beside him, hunched over, breathing hard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Dave exhaled, running a shaky hand down his face. Was it real? Josh wanted to say no, wanted to believe they had blacked out, imagined everything, but then his hand burned. He turned it over. There, etched into his palm, was a faintly burned outline of a punched ticket. His stomach dropped. Shaking, he fumbled for his camera. The battery light still blinked red. The footage indicator showing the recording had never stopped. Dave stared at his own camera. We have proof. Josh's fingers trembled as he pressed play. The footage rolled, grainy but clear. The train appearing from nowhere, the doors sliding open, their own hesitant steps inside. Then as the screen flickered, Josh saw something that made his blood freeze. In the recording, he turned toward the camera, but he never remembered doing that. The screen jittered, showing him staring directly into the lens, eyes hollow, mouth curling into a slow, knowing smile. Dave scrubbed through his own footage. His hands stopped moving. The final seconds of his recording showed them sitting right here, exactly as they were now, except in the video, something sat beside them. A long, thin shadow, a skeletal hand resting on the bench. And then the conductor leaned forward, grinning, and waved. And then, in the final seconds of the recording, the conductor's voice whispers directly into the mic. See you on the next ride. The video cut to black. The station fell silent. Josh's breath hitched. A chime echoed through the air. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a whistle rolled across the empty tracks. Dave swallowed hard. Josh. The neon arrival board above them flickered to life, displaying a new message. Midnight train, on time. A gust of cold wind rattled the station, and far, far down the tracks, a single headlight appeared. I've always considered myself a pretty tech-savvy guy. I'm the kind of person who's always curious about the latest gadgets, new software, and, more recently, the hidden corners of the internet. You know, the stuff that your average person wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. So naturally, I found myself intrigued by the idea of the dark web. I'd heard all the stories. Illegal marketplaces, conspiracy theories, secret societies. It was like a forbidden fruit. Something you know you shouldn't be interested in, but that just makes it more enticing. It all started a couple of months ago. I'd been watching videos about the dark web, reading articles, and lurking on forums where people shared their experiences. A lot of it seemed exaggerated, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something real behind all the hype. Eventually, curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to take the plunge. Downloading Tor was easy enough. Just a few clicks and I was in. For those who don't know, Tor is a browser that lets you access the dark web anonymously. It routes your connection through several different servers, making it nearly impossible for anyone to track you. At least that's what they say. The first time I opened it up, I didn't really know what to expect. I started with some of the safer sites, forums, blogs, stuff like that. It was all a bit underwhelming, to be honest. Most of it was just people talking about things you could find on any regular conspiracy theory site. I was about to give up when I stumbled across a forum thread titled Leaked Personal Info, Addresses, Phone Numbers, More. Now, I'm not proud of what I did next, but like I said, curiosity is a powerful thing. I clicked on the thread, and sure enough, it was a treasure trove of personal information. People were sharing addresses, phone numbers, emails, things that were probably obtained through data breaches or straight-up hacking. Most of the posts were old, but one caught my eye. It was just a few days old, and it listed an address not too far from where I live. I won't lie, there was a thrill in seeing that address. It felt like I was doing something I shouldn't be, and that only made it more exciting. I wasn't planning to do anything with the information, just look, you know? But the more I stared at it, the more this crazy idea started to form in my head. What if I sent something to that address? Nothing harmful, just a little prank. I knew it was dumb, but in the moment it seemed like a harmless bit of fun. So I grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and I wrote a short cryptic message. "I know what you did. We're watching." I folded the paper, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote the address on the front. I didn't include a return address, obviously. The next morning I dropped it in a mailbox on my way to work, feeling a mix of adrenaline and guilt. I figured it would freak them out a bit, and that would be the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. At first, nothing happened. Days went by and I almost forgot about the whole thing. It wasn't until about a week later that things started to get weird. I came home from work one evening, and there was a letter waiting for me in my mailbox. No return address, just my name in a messy, scrawled handwriting. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way anyone could have connected that letter to me, right? I used Tor. I was anonymous. But when I opened the letter, my blood ran cold. The letter was handwritten, just like mine, but the message was different. "We found you. We're coming." It was like something out of a horror movie. My first instinct was that it had to be a coincidence. Maybe it was just a prank. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. Who would go through the trouble of sending something like that to a random person? No, this felt deliberate, personal. I started to get paranoid. Every time I heard a noise outside, I'd jump. I'd find myself looking over my shoulder, checking the locks on my doors and windows more often than usual. But even then, I still clung to the hope that it was just a prank, some sort of sick joke. That hope was shattered the following week when I noticed a car parked across the street from my house. It wasn't one of my neighbor's cars, and it wasn't there before. It was just sitting there, engine off, with someone inside. I couldn't see who it was, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching. My heart started racing. I tried to stay calm, but it was impossible. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just someone waiting for a friend or a delivery. But the car didn't leave. It stayed there for hours, just sitting. When I went to bed that night, I closed the blinds, locked every door, and double-checked the windows. Sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, the car was gone. I thought maybe it was over, that they had gotten bored and moved on. But when I checked my mailbox, there was another letter. My hand shook as I opened it, fearing the worst. This time the message was even shorter, just 2 words. "Look outside." I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me not to, but I couldn't help myself. I slowly walked to the window, peeking through the blinds. The car was back, but this time, there were 2 figures standing outside of it, facing my house. Even from a distance, I could see they weren't normal. Their posture was stiff, unnatural, and they didn't move. They just stood there, staring at my house. That was when the fear really set in. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't just some harmless joke. I had messed with something I didn't understand, and now it was coming back to haunt me. I closed the blinds and backed away from the window, my mind racing. Who were these people? How had they found me? And more importantly, what did they want? I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. Calling the police seemed like the obvious choice, but what was I going to tell them? That I sent a creepy letter to some strangers and now they were stalking me. I'd sound like a lunatic. I needed to figure out what was going on before it got any worse. But deep down, I knew it already had. This was just the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those 2 figures standing outside my house, waiting. By morning, my nerves were frayed, and I felt like I was on the brink of a breakdown. I had to pull myself together, though. I couldn't afford to let fear consume me, not when I had no idea who or what I was dealing with. My first instinct was to do some research. I fired up my laptop and started digging through the dark web forums again, searching for any mention of the address I'd found. Maybe there was something I'd missed, some clue that could explain who these people were. But the more I searched, the more I realized how vast and chaotic the dark web really was. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but the haystack is constantly shifting. and the needle might not even exist. After hours of fruitless searching, I stumbled upon a thread discussing cursed addresses. Apparently, there were certain places that had a reputation for being linked to bad things. Haunted houses, old crime scenes, stuff like that. But there was one post that stood out to me. It mentioned an address, eerily similar to the one I had sent the letter to, and claimed it was tied to a series of unexplained disappearances. According to the post, anyone who messed with that address, whether by visiting, sending something, or even just talking about it, would end up on the radar of a cult that was known for punishing curiosity. The details were vague, probably intentionally, but the implication was clear. If you got their attention, you were in deep trouble. I laughed it off at first. A cult? Really? It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. But then I remembered the two figures standing outside my house. Could it be possible? Could I have actually provoked some kind of twisted group by sending that stupid letter? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the people in the car were just weird neighbors. Or maybe it was some elaborate prank by someone who knew I'd been dabbling in the dark web. But deep down, I knew I couldn't dismiss the possibility. If it was true, I needed to be careful. Very careful. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the paranoia never left me. I started noticing little things that were off, footsteps behind me when I was walking home, unfamiliar cars driving slowly past my house, and shadows moving outside my windows at night. I couldn't prove any of it, of course. It was all just glimpses, sounds, things you could easily explain away. But when you're already on edge, every small thing feels like a threat. I decided to tell my friend Josh about what was going on. He's the kind of guy who's into conspiracy theories and all that, so I figured he might have some insight, or at least help me calm down. We met up at a local coffee shop, and I laid it all out for him, downloading Tor, finding the address, sending the letter, and the strange things that had been happening since. Josh listened intently, his expression growing more serious as I talked. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Man, that's messed up," he finally said. "You know, I've heard stories about people getting in over their heads on the dark web, but I always thought it was just urban legend stuff. This sounds real." I nodded, feeling a little better just having someone else believe me. "What do you think I should do?" Josh shrugged. "Well, first off, I'd get rid of anything that could link you back to the dark web. Clear your browser history, delete any files, maybe even get a new computer if you're really freaked out. And definitely don't go back on Tor, not if these people are really after you." I hadn't even thought about that. If they could track me down from a letter, maybe they could trace my online activity too. I made a mental note to do a full wipe of my laptop when I got home. "Also," Josh continued, "you might want to think about moving, at least for a little while. If they know where you live, staying here might not be safe." The idea of moving was unsettling, but I couldn't deny that he had a point. I didn't know who these people were or how far they were willing to go. The thought of abandoning my home, though, was something I wasn't ready to consider. Maybe if things got worse, but for now, I wanted to believe it wouldn't come to that. We talked for a while longer, but there wasn't much else Josh could offer in the way of advice. As I headed home, I tried to keep calm, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Every person I passed on the street, every car that drove by seemed suspicious. By the time I got home, I was a nervous wreck. I spent the rest of the day wiping my laptop clean, getting rid of anything that might connect me to the dark web. I even considered changing my phone number, but I wasn't sure how much that would help. As night fell, I locked up the house as securely as I could, trying to convince myself that I was safe. But deep down, I knew that nothing I did would stop them. Whoever they were, they had found me once and they could find me again. All I could do was wait and hope that I hadn't crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the faint sound of a car engine outside. My heart started racing, and I slowly got up, moving as quietly as I could. I peeked through the blinds, and there it was. The same car, parked across the street, with its headlights off. I could just make out two figures inside, their faces hidden in the darkness. I backed away from the window, trying to control my breathing. I knew then that this wasn't going to go away on its own. Whatever I had gotten myself into, it was real, and it was far from over. I didn't sleep that night either. The fear had taken root, and it wasn't letting go. I was in over my head, and there was no easy way out. The worst part was knowing that this was all my fault. If I hadn't been so stupid, if I hadn't sent that letter, none of this would be happening. But it was too late for regrets. All I could do now was try to survive and hope that somehow I could find a way to make it right. When the sun finally crept over the horizon the next morning, I was exhausted. 2 nights without sleep had left me in a state of paranoia-fueled delirium, but I knew I had to keep my wits about me. The car was gone by the time I checked, but I could still feel the lingering presence of those 2 figures, like they had left a shadow hanging over my house. I called in sick to work that day. I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on anything until I figured out what was going on, and going to work felt like too big of a risk. What if they followed me there? What if they cornered me somewhere I couldn't escape? The thought alone made my stomach churn. I spent most of the day glued to my windows, watching for any sign of the car or anyone who looked out of place. Every noise outside made me jump, and every knock at the door sent my heart racing. I even thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? That I'd been stalking some random address on the dark web and now I was being followed by a mysterious couple? I didn't want to risk sounding crazy, and besides, I had no real proof. Around midday, I received a text message from an unknown number. It was a simple, chilling message: "We're closer than you think." That was it. No explanation, no threats, just a statement that sent my anxiety through the roof. I tried to trace the number, but it led nowhere, just like I expected. Whoever these people were, they knew how to cover their tracks. I felt like a trapped animal, surrounded by predators who were toying with me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Desperation was setting in, and I realized I couldn't do this alone. I needed help, but who could I trust? Josh was the only person I'd confided in, and as much as he wanted to help, I didn't want to drag him any deeper into this mess. But I knew if I didn't reach out to someone soon, things could take a turn for the worse. That evening, I decided to stay at a hotel for the night. I packed a small bag with essentials and left my house just before sunset, trying to act as normal as possible. I didn't see the car, and for a moment I thought maybe I'd lost them. But as I walked to the bus stop, I caught a glimpse of a dark sedan in my peripheral vision. It was parked on a side street, its windows tinted so dark that I couldn't see inside. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep walking, even though every instinct was telling me to run. The bus ride to the hotel was nerve-wracking. Every time the bus stopped, I expected to see that car pull up behind us, but it never did. By the time I reached the hotel, I was a bundle of nerves, jumping at every little sound. I checked in under a fake name, paying cash to avoid leaving any traceable trail. The clerk gave me a curious look, but didn't ask any questions. I guess I wasn't the first person to come through looking over their shoulder. Once I was in the room, I locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing mind. The room was small, impersonal, but it felt safer than my house. For the first time in days, I started to relax, until my phone buzzed. I almost didn't want to look, but curiosity got the better of me. It was another text, this time a picture. My stomach dropped when I opened it. It was a photo of me, taken from behind as I entered the hotel. The message underneath read, "Running won't help." I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. They had followed me here. They knew where I was, and no matter how much I tried to hide, they were always one step ahead. I felt like I was spiraling into panic, my thoughts racing in 100 different directions. How were they tracking me? My phone, my movements? Had they somehow planted something on me without my knowing? I knew I needed to think clearly, but the fear was overwhelming. I had to do something, anything, to shake them off. I considered leaving the hotel, but where would I go? I couldn't go home, and if they could track me this easily, nowhere felt safe. After pacing the room for what felt like hours, I decided to try something different. I'd been so focused on hiding that I hadn't considered confronting them. Maybe if I let them know I was on to them, that I wasn't going to be an easy target, they'd back off. It was a long shot, but I was out of options. I sent a text back to the number that had been messaging me. "What do you want from me?" It was the only thing I could think to say, a desperate plea for some sort of resolution. I watched the screen, waiting for a reply, but none came. The silence was worse than anything else, leaving me alone with my growing fear. Hours passed, and I sat there staring at my phone, hoping for an answer. But nothing came. I began to wonder if I'd made a mistake by reaching out. Maybe I'd just provoked them further, or maybe they were planning their next move. Either way, the uncertainty was driving me mad. As the night wore on, I realized I wasn't going to get any sleep. Every creak of the hotel room, every distant noise from the hallway made me jump. I kept expecting the door to burst open, for them to come charging in and finish whatever they had started. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those two figures standing outside my house, waiting. By morning, my nerves were frayed, and I felt like I was on the brink of a breakdown. I had to pull myself together, though. I couldn't afford to let fear consume me, not when I had no idea who or what I was dealing with. My first instinct was to do some research. I fired up my laptop and started digging through the dark web forums again, searching for any mention of the address I'd found. Maybe there was something I'd missed, some clue that could explain who these people were. But the more I searched, the more I realized how vast and chaotic the dark web really was. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but the haystack is constantly shifting, and the needle might not even exist. After hours of fruitless searching, I stumbled upon a thread discussing cursed addresses. Apparently, there were certain places that had a reputation for being linked to bad things. Haunted houses, old crime scenes, stuff like that. But there was one post that stood out to me. It mentioned an address, eerily similar to the one I had sent the letter to, and claimed it was tied to a series of unexplained disappearances. According to the post, anyone who messed with that address, whether by visiting, sending something, or even just talking about it, would end up on the radar of a cult that was known for punishing curiosity. The details were vague, probably intentionally, but the implication was clear. If you got their attention, you were in deep trouble. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance, constantly looking over my shoulder, barely sleeping, and trying to stay one step ahead of whoever was tracking me. But the truth was, I was running on fumes. No matter where I went or how much I tried to cover my tracks, I knew they were always right behind me. The text messages didn't stop. They became a constant reminder that they were watching, that there was no place I could hide where they couldn't find me. Each message was a subtle nudge, pushing me closer to the edge, eroding what little sense of safety I had left. "Nice hat," one of them read after I'd bought a new cap at a random store, hoping to blend in better. Another simply said, "Smile for the camera," accompanied by a grainy photo of me walking down a busy street, my face turned slightly towards the lens. I couldn't figure out how they were doing it. I ditched my phone, using burner phones instead. I varied my routes, avoided places I usually went, and even considered changing my appearance more drastically. But it didn't matter. They always found me. It was as if they had eyes everywhere, an invisible network of watchers who could see every move I made. It was during this time that I decided I had to stop running and start fighting back. It was a desperate plan, but I was out of options. If they wanted to play games, I'd play too, but on my terms. I needed to draw them out, force them to reveal themselves, and then, well, I wasn't sure what I'd do next. But I had to do something. Sitting back and waiting to be caught was no longer an option. I chose a location I knew well, a park on the edge of town that was usually quiet at night. It was a place where I could see anyone coming from a distance, but also where I knew the terrain. If they were going to confront me, I wanted it to be on my turf. I sent them a text from the burner phone. "Let's end this. Meet me at the park, midnight." I didn't expect them to respond, but they did. Almost immediately, a single word popped up on the screen. "Okay." That night, I arrived at the park early, dressed in dark clothes and carrying nothing but a flashlight and the burner phone. The park was eerily silent, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty pathways, and the air was thick with tension. I found a spot near a cluster of trees where I could watch the main entrance without being easily seen. My heart was pounding in my chest, every nerve on edge as I waited for them to show up. Minutes ticked by, each one dragging out longer than the last. My eyes scanned the darkness, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that I wasn't alone. I kept telling myself that this was it, that I was finally going to face whoever had been tormenting me. But as the clock crept closer to midnight, doubt began to creep in. What if this was a trap? What if they had no intention of meeting me here, and this was just another way to mess with my head? Then, just as I was about to give up, I saw them. Two figures emerged from the shadows near the park entrance, their movements slow and deliberate. They were dressed in black, blending in with the night, but I could see their faces clearly in the dim light of the street lamps. My stomach churned as I recognized them. It was the same couple from the car, the same two people who had been watching my house. They walked towards me with an eerie calm, as if they had all the time in the world. I could feel my palms sweating, my grip on the flashlight tightening as they drew closer. I forced myself to step out from my hiding spot, determined not to let them see how scared I was. This was my only chance to get answers, and I wasn't going to blow it. When they were just a few feet away, they stopped. The woman smiled at me, a cold, unsettling smile that didn't reach her eyes. The man remained expressionless, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "What do you want from me?" The woman tilted her head slightly, as if considering my question. "You wanted to know, didn't you?" she said, her voice soft but laced with something sinister. "You were curious about us, about that address. Curiosity can be dangerous." I swallowed hard, trying to maintain eye contact. I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a joke, a stupid prank. I didn't know. The man finally spoke, his voice deep and unnervingly calm. "There are some things you don't mess with. You should have known better." I felt a wave of anger mixed with fear rising in my chest. "Known better? How was I supposed to know any of this? Who are you?" The woman's smile widened. "We're the ones who clean up messes like you. People who stick their noses where they don't belong, who think they're safe behind a screen. But there's always a way to find someone if you know where to look." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I realized then that this wasn't just about the letter I'd sent. These people, this couple, were part of something bigger, something far more dangerous than I had imagined. They weren't just stalking me. They were sending a message, enforcing some twisted set of rules that I had unwittingly broken. "Please," I said, my voice cracking. "I'll do whatever you want. Just leave me alone." The man took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You've already opened the door. Now you have to see what's on the other side." My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. but I knew I was trapped. They had me right where they wanted me, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. Desperation clawed at me, and I made a split-second decision. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away from them. My feet pounded against the pavement as I sprinted through the park, the trees blurring around me. I could hear their footsteps behind me, steady and relentless, as if they knew there was no point in hurrying. They were toying with me, letting me exhaust myself before they made their move. I zigzagged through the park, trying to lose them in the darkness, but every time I glanced back, they were there, always the same distance behind me, always just close enough to remind me that escape was impossible. When the police arrived, I was still in a state of shock, my thoughts jumbled and incoherent. They found me sitting on the floor of the convenience store, clutching the broken bottle like a lifeline. The clerk had already told them what he knew, which wasn't much, just that a terrified guy had stumbled in, begging for help. The officers were surprisingly calm as they guided me outside and into the back of a squad car. They asked me questions, where I was from, what had happened, if I was hurt, but I struggled to find the words. All I could think about was the couple, those cold, calculating eyes, and the feeling that no matter what I did, they were always going to be one step ahead. At the station, they let me sit in a small, nondescript room while I tried to gather my thoughts. Eventually, a detective came in, a woman with a kind face and a no-nonsense demeanor. She introduced herself as Detective Harris and took a seat across from me, her eyes full of concern. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked, her voice gentle. I hesitated, still not sure how much of my story would sound believable. But I had to try. I had to make her understand that this wasn't just paranoia, that these people were real and dangerous. So I started from the beginning, recounting everything as best as I could. Downloading Tor, finding the address, sending the letter, and the nightmare that had followed. I could see the skepticism in her eyes as I talked about the dark web and the messages, but she didn't interrupt. She just listened, letting me spill out the fear and confusion that had been building up inside me for days. When I finished, there was a long silence. Detective Harris leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You're sure it was the same couple every time?" she asked. I nodded. Positive. They even sent me a picture of myself at the hotel. They knew where I was, even when I thought I'd lost them. She frowned, her brow furrowing in concentration. "We'll look into it," she said, though I could hear the doubt in her voice. "But I have to be honest with you. Tracking people through the dark web is difficult, and without more concrete evidence, it might be hard to find them." My heart sank. I knew she was right, but it didn't make me feel any better. I had hoped that by coming here, by telling my story, I might finally be free of the terror that had been consuming me. But instead, I felt more lost than ever. "We'll do what we can," she continued, her tone softening. "But in the meantime, I'd recommend staying with a friend or family member, somewhere safe. Don't go back to your house until we have a better idea of what's going on." I agreed, though I wasn't sure where I'd go. I didn't want to drag anyone else into this mess. But the thought of being alone again was too much to bear. I thanked her, and after a few more questions, she let me go. They offered to give me a ride, but I declined. I needed some time to think, to process everything that had happened. I wandered the streets for a while, aimlessly trying to make sense of the situation. The city felt alien to me now, full of hidden threats and unseen dangers. Every stranger I passed seemed like a potential enemy. Every shadow a place where the couple might be hiding, waiting for their chance to strike. As the day turned to evening, I finally decided to head to Josh's place. He was the only person who knew what was going on, and even though I hated the idea of putting him at risk, I couldn't face this alone anymore. I texted him as I made my way to his apartment, asking if I could crash there for a few days. He replied almost immediately, telling me to come over, no questions asked. When I arrived, Josh greeted me with a worried expression. "Dude, you look like hell," he said, ushering me inside. "What happened?" I told him everything, trying to keep my voice steady. He listened quietly, his face growing more serious with each passing minute. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Man, this is messed up. I can't believe they've been following you like that. You're sure it's not just some crazy coincidence?" "It's not," I said firmly. "They knew where I was, Josh. They knew everything." He nodded, his expression grim. "Okay, well, you can stay here as long as you need to. We'll figure something out." I was grateful, more than I could express. We spent the rest of the evening trying to come up with a plan, though neither of us had any brilliant ideas. We talked about going to the police again, maybe hiring a private investigator, but it all felt like grasping at straws. The couple had been so careful, so precise in their actions. It was like they knew exactly how to avoid getting caught. As the night wore on, Josh suggested we try to get some sleep, promising to keep an eye out for anything unusual. I was exhausted, but the thought of closing my eyes, of letting my guard down, was terrifying. Still, I knew I needed rest if I was going to keep my wits about me. I slept fitfully, waking at every little noise, my mind racing with images of the couple standing over me, their cold smiles frozen in place. But morning eventually came, and with it, a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I'd managed to escape them for now. But that hope was short-lived. When we woke up, Josh's phone buzzed with a notification. He frowned, checking the screen, and then his face went pale. "You need to see this," he said, handing me the phone. It was an email, sent from an anonymous address. The subject line was blank, but the body of the email contained a single image, a photo of me and Josh taken through the window of his apartment. We were sitting on the couch, deep in conversation, completely unaware that we were being watched. My blood ran cold. They had found me again. No matter where I went, no matter how carefully I tried to cover my tracks, they were always there, watching, waiting. Josh looked at me, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. "How is this even possible?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But I don't think they're ever going to stop." For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Then Josh stood up, his jaw set with determination. "We can't just sit here and let them keep doing this. We have to do something." I nodded, though I had no idea what that something would be. But I knew he was right. We couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. If we were going to survive this, we had to face it head on, no matter how terrifying the prospect. We spent the day researching, trying to find any information we could about similar cases, about how to track down people who seemed to be ghosts. It was slow going, and most of what we found was either unhelpful or downright scary. But we kept at it, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. As the day turned into night, we made a decision. We were going to go back to the address, the place where all of this had started. It was a long shot, but maybe there was something there, something that could give us a clue about who these people were and how to stop them. Armed with nothing but our phones and a flashlight, we set out under the cover of darkness, our nerves stretched thin. The streets were eerily quiet as we made our way across town, the shadows seeming to close in around us as we approached the address. When we finally reached the house, my heart was pounding in my chest. It looked just as unremarkable as it had in the photos, a small nondescript building in a quiet neighborhood. But there was an air of menace about it, a sense that we were walking into something far more dangerous than we could comprehend. We hesitated at the gate, exchanging a glance that conveyed our shared fear, but we knew we couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the gate open, the rusty hinges creaking in the silence. We stepped inside the yard, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark, its front door slightly ajar as if it had been waiting for us. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run as fast as I could in the opposite direction. But I forced myself to keep moving, one step at a time. When we reached the door, Josh motioned for me to stay back. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. We stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. The interior was just as ordinary as the outside. Faded wallpaper, old furniture, nothing out of place. But there was something wrong, something we couldn't see but could feel in our bones. We searched the house, moving room by room, but found nothing. No signs of the couple, no indication of who they were or what they wanted. It was as if the place had been abandoned for years, untouched by human hands. But just as we were about to give up, I noticed something strange. In the corner of the living room, half hidden under a pile of old newspapers, was a small door, almost like a hatch leading down into the floor. My heart skipped a beat as I pointed it out to Josh, who immediately grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the door. "What do you think's down there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's only one way to find out," I replied, though the thought of going down there filled me with dread. We carefully moved the newspapers aside, revealing the door in full. It was old, the wood warped and splintered, but it wasn't locked. With a deep breath, Josh pulled it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. A set of narrow stairs led down into the darkness below. The air that wafted up was cold and musty, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of earth and rot. I could barely make out the bottom of the stairs in the dim light. But there was something down there, something we needed to see. Josh and I exchanged one last look before we descended the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The steps creaked under our weight, each one echoing in the confined space. As we reached the bottom, the light revealed a small, cramped basement, the walls lined with shelves covered in old jars and dusty boxes. But it was what lay in the center of the room that caught our attention. A table stood in the middle, covered with papers, photos, and what looked like old police reports. And there, pinned to the wall above the table, was a map of the city, our city. Dozens of red pins were stuck into the map, marking locations all over town. Some of the pins had photos attached to them, grainy, low-quality images of people, most of them looking scared, confused, hunted. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized some of the locations. They were places I'd been recently: Josh's apartment, the park, the convenience store. It was a map of our movements, a record of everywhere we'd gone, everything we'd done since this nightmare began. "They've been watching us," Josh said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "They've been watching us this whole time." I stepped closer to the table, my eyes scanning the papers spread out across it. Most of them were newspaper clippings, stories about disappearances, unsolved cases, people who had vanished without a trace. And there, among the clippings, was a photo that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me, taken from the same angle as the first photo they had sent me when I'd walked into that hotel. But there was something different about this one. In the background, just barely visible, was the couple, the man and woman who had been stalking me. They were standing at a distance, their faces turned towards the camera, their expressions as blank and emotionless as ever. "They've done this before," I muttered, piecing it all together. "All those people who disappeared, they're part of it. This is what they do." Josh nodded, his face pale. "And now we're their latest targets." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a game to them, it was a ritual, something they had done to countless others before us. And now, we were next in line. But before we could process what to do next, we heard it. A creak from above, the sound of the front door opening. "They're here," Josh whispered, his voice barely audible. We were trapped, deep in the bowels of the house, with no easy way out. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to think clearly. We had to move, had to find a way to escape before they cornered us. I glanced around the basement, looking for any exit, any potential hiding spot. There in the corner was an old window, small but just big enough for us to squeeze through. "Over there," I hissed, pointing it out to Josh. We hurried over, trying to be as quiet as possible. Josh pulled at the window, and to our relief it opened with a soft creak. "Go," he urged, motioning for me to climb through first. I didn't need to be told twice. I squeezed through the narrow opening, my heart pounding as I wriggled out into the cold night air. Josh followed close behind, his breathing ragged as he pulled himself out of the basement. We were outside, but the danger was far from over. I could hear the couple moving through the house, their footsteps slow and deliberate as they searched for us. "We need to run," I said, my voice trembling. Josh nodded, and without another word we took off into the night, sprinting away from the house as fast as our legs could carry us. The darkness closed in around us, but we didn't stop, didn't dare look back. We just ran, driven by the fear that they were right behind us. Eventually we made it back to the street, our breath coming in ragged gasps as we slowed to a stop. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened, everything we had discovered. "We can't go back," Josh said, his voice hoarse. "They'll keep coming for us." "I know," I replied, my thoughts spinning. "But we can't keep running either. We need help." We agreed that the only option left was to go back to the police, to show them what we had found. It was a risk, but it was the only chance we had to stop this nightmare for good. As we walked, our pace quick but no longer frantic, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just a random mistake I'd made on the dark web. These people, this couple, were part of something much larger, much darker than I had ever imagined. And we had only scratched the surface. When we finally reached the police station, it was the middle of the night. We were both exhausted, but we knew we couldn't wait. We had to show them what we had found, had to make them believe us. Detective Harris was still there, and when she saw us, her expression immediately shifted to one of concern. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "We found something," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline. "You need to see this." We led her to a private room and showed her the photos, the map, the evidence we had found in the basement. As she looked through everything, her expression grew more serious, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "This is disturbing," she finally said, her voice laced with concern. "I'll need to get a team on this right away. If what you're saying is true, then these people are extremely dangerous." "They are," I insisted, "and they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Detective Harris nodded, already moving into action. "We'll put out a citywide alert, see if we can track them down. In the meantime, you two need to stay somewhere safe. We can arrange protective custody if necessary." Josh and I agreed, knowing that we couldn't let our guard down for even a moment. But as we were led to a safe location, one thought kept gnawing at me. A sense of unfinished business, of a mystery that was far from solved. The couple had been stopped for now, but the fear that they, or others like them, were still out there was impossible to shake. I had peered into a dark corner of the world, one that most people never even knew existed. And even though I had escaped with my life, I knew I would never truly be free of the shadow they had cast over me. The experience had changed me forever, left me with scars that would never fully heal. But it had also taught me something important, something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. There are some things you're better off not knowing, some doors that should never be opened, some mysteries that are best left unsolved. Because sometimes when you go looking for the unknown finds you, and when it does, it doesn't let go. I should have known better. You know, one of those gut feelings that tells you this is a bad idea, but you ignore it because greed gets in the way? Yeah, that was me about 2 months ago. I thought I had found a loophole, a way to make easy money that wouldn't hurt anyone, just a harmless little con, or so I convinced myself. But now I'm starting to regret it deeply, because I think someone is out to get me, And I'm not talking about a debt collector or a pissed-off customer. This is something much worse. It all started when I stumbled upon an old stash of fake gold coins in my grandpa's attic. He passed away last year, and we were cleaning out his house when I found them hidden in an old cigar box. They were well made, almost convincing, but a trained eye could spot they weren't real gold. Still, I couldn't help but think they had some value. If not as collectibles, then maybe I could sell them off as authentic on the dark web. I mean, I'd heard stories of people doing worse things and getting away with it, so why not? I should mention here that I'm no stranger to the internet, including its more obscure corners. I've bought a few things off the dark web before, mostly small stuff, nothing illegal, just weird little trinkets that caught my eye. I knew how to navigate the marketplaces, how to keep my identity hidden, and how to make sure I wasn't traced. Or at least I thought I did. I created a seller's account under a pseudonym, Gold Rusher 22, and listed the coins as authentic, giving them a backstory that was just believable enough. They were supposedly from the early 1800s, minted by some obscure European nation, and had been passed down through my family for generations. I made sure to include detailed photos, descriptions of their weight, and even some nonsense about their historical significance. I priced them high enough to look legitimate, but not so high as to draw too much attention. To my surprise, it didn't take long for someone to bite. Within a week, I had an offer from a buyer who went by the username Mr. Gold 55. He seemed genuinely interested, asking all the right questions, but not too many, if you know what I mean. We agreed on a price, and I shipped the coins off to some P.O. box in a small town I'd never heard of. The transaction was smooth, and within a few days the money was in my Bitcoin wallet. Easy as that. For a while, I thought I'd pulled it off. I even started thinking about what else I could sell, but something in the back of my mind told me to wait. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe I was just cautious by nature. Either way, I decided to lay low for a while. A couple of weeks passed without incident, and I almost forgot about the whole thing. Then, last Thursday, I got an email. Not on my regular account, but on the encrypted email I'd used for the transaction. The subject line was empty, but when I opened it, there was a single line of text. "We need to talk about those coins." I remember feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. It was like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over me. I reread the email several times, hoping I was just imagining things, but it was there, plain as day. My mind started racing. Who was this? How did they know? I hadn't told anyone about the coins, and I was certain I hadn't left any loose ends. Or had I? I decided to ignore it. Maybe it was a scam or someone trying to scare me. But the next day there was another email, this time with an attachment. The subject still blank, but the message was clear. "You've made a mistake." The attachment was a photo of my house. My stomach dropped. It was taken from the street, but it was unmistakably my house. The angle, the driveway, the flowers my mom had planted along the walkway. It was all there. Someone knew where I lived. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every rustle outside made me jump. I kept checking my windows, looking out to see if anyone was out there, but the street was empty. My mind was spinning with fear and regret. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just a stupid con, something to make a quick buck. I never thought it would come to this. I wanted to reply to the email, ask who they were and what they wanted, but something stopped me. What if they were bluffing? What if responding made things worse? I was stuck, not knowing what to do. By the next morning, I decided to stay home from work. I called in sick and spent the day trying to figure out what my next move should be. But nothing came to mind. I was scared, and more than that, I was angry. Angry at myself for being so stupid, and angry at whoever was doing this for targeting me. That night, the third email came. This time it was a video. No message, no subject line, just a video file. My hands were shaking as I clicked on it. The video was shaky like it was recorded on a phone. It showed someone walking through my neighborhood at night, their footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. Then the camera panned up to my house, zooming in on my bedroom window. The video cut off just as the camera started to move closer to the door. I was petrified. They were close, maybe even right outside. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was out there in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't know what to do. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I sold fake gold coins on the dark web and now someone was after me? They'd probably laugh me off, or worse, arrest me for fraud. So here I am, writing this out in the hopes that anyone might have some advice or insight. I've never been this scared in my life, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Every night, I dread the next email, the next photo or video. I'm trapped in my own home, too afraid to leave, but too paranoid to stay. If anyone's been through something like this before, please let me know what I should do. I'm running out of options, and I'm terrified of what might happen next. I spent the next few days in a state of constant anxiety. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and I could barely think straight. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone lurking outside my window, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly on edge, jumping at every little noise. It was driving me insane. I kept checking my email, half hoping there wouldn't be another message, and half expecting one to pop up at any moment. But after the video, there was nothing. No messages, no photos, no videos. Just silence. You'd think that would be a relief, right? But it only made things worse. The waiting, the not knowing what was coming next, was torture. I finally broke down and told my best friend Mark what was going on. I didn't go into all the details, like the part about selling fake gold coins on the dark web. But I told him enough to make him understand I was scared. Mark's the kind of guy who always seems to have things figured out. He's calm, level-headed, and has a way of making even the worst situations seem manageable. I thought maybe he could help me see this whole thing from a different perspective. When I finished explaining, Mark was quiet for a moment, just staring at me like he was trying to process everything I'd just unloaded on him. Then he said, "You know, it sounds like someone's messing with you. Have you pissed anyone off recently?" I shook my head. "No, not that I can think of, and I haven't told anyone about this, not until now." Mark sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, clearly thinking hard about what to say next. "Look, it could be some hacker or scammer trying to scare you. Maybe they found out your address somehow and are using it to freak you out. But I think the best thing to do is lay low for a bit, stay off the dark web, and don't respond to any more emails. If they don't get a reaction out of you, they might lose interest." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I had this nagging feeling that it wasn't that simple. This wasn't just someone trying to scare me. It felt personal, like they had a specific reason for targeting me. But Mark was right about one thing. I needed to stay calm and not do anything that might make the situation worse. Over the next few days, I did my best to follow Mark's advice. I didn't check my email as obsessively, tried to distract myself with work, and even forced myself to go out for a bit just to get some fresh air and clear my head. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, like someone was observing my every move. I started taking different routes to and from work, avoiding the same routines, hoping that would throw off whoever was following me. But then, last Sunday, something happened that threw me back into full-blown panic mode. I was coming home from the grocery store just trying to keep my mind off things, when I noticed a car parked across the street from my house. It wasn't a car I recognized, just an old, beat-up sedan with tinted windows. At first, I tried to brush it off, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The car had no license plate, not even a temporary tag. I didn't go straight into my house. Instead, I kept walking, pretending I hadn't noticed the car, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I made a loop around the block, trying to think of what to do. By the time I got back, the car was gone. But the unease it left behind was enough to keep me up all night. The next day, I found a note taped to my front door. It was just a plain piece of paper folded in half with a single sentence written in block letters. Stop what you're doing, or else. No name, no signature, just those 7 words. I remember feeling this sick, twisting sensation in my gut. This wasn't a joke, and it definitely wasn't random. Someone knew who I was, what I'd done, and they were serious about making me pay for it. I took the note inside and stared at it for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it all. What did they want from me? Was it money? Revenge? Or was it something worse? I didn't have any answers, and the more I thought about it, the more my fear grew. I knew I needed to do something, but what? I couldn't go to the police, not without incriminating myself, and I couldn't keep ignoring the threat. Whoever was behind this was escalating, and I had no idea what they were planning next. By now, the fear had settled into something deeper, more insidious. It was like a shadow that followed me everywhere, constantly reminding me that I was in danger. I started noticing little things that didn't seem right, like the man who walked past my house 3 times in one day, or the strange calls I started getting from unknown numbers. I didn't answer, but each time my phone rang, I felt my heart leap into my throat. One night, I finally decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to do something, anything, to regain some control over the situation. I considered responding to the emails, trying to reason with whoever was behind this, but that idea terrified me more than anything. What if it made things worse? Instead, I decided to take a different approach. I started researching how to protect myself, how to secure my home, how to make sure no one could trace me online, and how to stay safe if things escalated. I installed security cameras around my house, changed all my passwords, and even set up a few traps around my property just in case someone tried to break in. But deep down, I knew that no amount of security measures would protect me from the fear that had taken root in my mind. I was no longer just scared of the emails or the threats. I was scared of what I might do if pushed too far. Scared of how this situation was changing me, making me paranoid, and turning me into someone I didn't recognize. I kept telling myself that it would all blow over, that whoever was behind this would lose interest and move on. But as the days passed, that hope started to fade. I knew I was in too deep, and there was no easy way out. I had made a mistake, one that might cost me more than I ever imagined. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm terrified of finding out. All I can do now is wait, and hope that I find a way to end this before it's too late. I spent the next few days trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the truth was, I was unraveling. My nerves were frayed, and every little thing set me on edge. The security cameras I installed around my house became my new obsession. I found myself checking the footage constantly, looking for anything out of the ordinary. A car that lingered too long, a shadow that seemed out of place. But the more I watched, the more paranoid I became. I started noticing things that probably weren't even there. A flash of movement in the corner of the screen, a sound that didn't belong. It was like my mind was playing tricks on me. The worst part was, I couldn't tell what was real and what was just my fear getting the better of me. One night around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of something crashing outside. My heart raced as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept next to my bed and crept toward the window. Peeking through the blinds, I couldn't see anything at first, just the empty street, bathed in the pale light of the street lamp. But then I noticed the trash cans at the end of my driveway, knocked over and spilling garbage into the road. It could have been a raccoon or a stray dog, but in my heightened state, I was convinced it was something more sinister. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the security camera feed. The footage showed a shadowy figure at the edge of the screen, just barely visible, before the cans went flying. Whoever it was, they were gone now, but the damage was done. My mind was racing with thoughts of who it could be and what they wanted. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Instead, I sat in the dark, bat in hand, waiting for anything to happen. But nothing did. The hours ticked by, and as dawn broke, I felt more exhausted than ever. The lack of sleep was wearing me down, making it harder to think straight, harder to stay calm. The next day, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to tell someone the full story, someone who might be able to help me figure out what to do next. That's when I called my older brother, Tom. He's always been the protective type. Growing up, he was the one who'd chase off bullies and make sure I was safe. I figured if anyone could help me, it would be him. I met Tom at a diner on the other side of town, far from my house. I didn't want to risk being followed, and I felt safer in a public place. As soon as I sat down, I could tell he knew something was seriously wrong. I didn't waste any time. I told him everything, from the fake gold coins to the emails, the videos, and now the strange occurrences outside my house. Tom listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with every word. When I finally finished, he leaned back in his chair, staring at me with a look that was a mix of concern and disbelief. "Why the hell didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked, his voice low but intense. I shrugged, feeling a wave of guilt wash over me. "I thought I could handle it, or that it would just blow over. But it's getting worse, Tom. I don't know what to do." Tom shook his head, clearly frustrated, but he didn't lash out at me. Instead, he leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "First off, we're going to figure out who's behind this. I know a guy. He's a private investigator, and he's good at this sort of thing. We'll see if he can trace the emails, figure out where they're coming from. And if this creep is following you, we'll catch him." For the first time in weeks, I felt a small glimmer of hope. Tom's plan sounded solid, and the idea of having someone on my side, someone who knew what they were doing, was a huge relief. I agreed to let him contact the investigator and set things in motion. Over the next few days, I stayed in close contact with Tom, updating him on anything unusual that happened. The investigator started digging into the emails, but it was slow going. Whoever was behind this was careful, covering their tracks well. But Tom assured me that we'd get to the bottom of it, that it was only a matter of time. Meanwhile, the strange incidents around my house continued. The night after I met with Tom, I found a dead bird on my front porch. Its neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, and there was no sign of what had killed it. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. Someone had put it there, as a message. I called Tom immediately, and he came over, bringing the investigator with him. The investigator, a gruff man in his 50s with a no-nonsense attitude, took one look at the bird and frowned. "This isn't random," he said, his voice flat. "Whoever's doing this is trying to send a message. They want you to know they're close." Hearing those words made my skin crawl. I knew it was true, but having someone else confirm it made it all the more real. The investigator took the bird, saying he'd have it checked for any traces of who might have left it. Meanwhile, Tom insisted that I stay at his place for a few days just to be safe. Staying at Tom's gave me some peace of mind, but it didn't stop the dread from creeping in every time I thought about what was happening. I felt like I was losing control, like this situation was spiraling into something I couldn't manage. I kept thinking back to the emails, the videos, the note on my door. What was the end game here? What did this person want from me? A few days later, the investigator called with news. He had managed to trace one of the emails back to a server in Eastern Europe, but it was a dead end. The person behind this had routed their messages through so many layers of anonymity that it was nearly impossible to track them down. But there was one thing he could tell me. Whoever was sending these emails was highly skilled. This wasn't just some random person messing with me. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Hearing that only made me more anxious. If this person was that skilled, what else were they capable of? I couldn't help but feel like I was in way over my head. But Tom and the investigator weren't giving up. And that gave me some strength to keep going, to not let fear completely take over. But then just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. Late one night, after I had finally managed to fall asleep at Tom's place, I was jolted awake by the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a text message from an unknown number. My heart raced as I opened it. The message was short, just a few words. "You can't hide forever." Attached to the message was a photo. It showed me, asleep in Tom's guest room, taken from just outside the window. My blood ran cold. They knew where I was. They had been right outside, watching me. The panic that I had been trying to keep at bay surged back with full force. I jumped out of bed, locking the windows and turning on every light in the room. I called Tom, who rushed in, and when he saw the photo, his expression darkened. "We need to end this," he said, his voice grim. "And fast." I nodded, too shaken to say much. I knew we were running out of time. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing games anymore. They were getting closer, and I had no idea how to stop them. The next morning I woke up with a gnawing sense of dread. The text message from the night before still haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Tom had already left for work, but before he did, he made it clear that he was going to get in touch with the investigator again and see what more could be done. He also suggested that I stay put at his place for a few more days, just to be safe. But after the photo, I wasn't sure if any place was safe anymore. I spent most of that day holed up in Tom's guest room, jumping at every little noise. The once comforting sounds of a neighborhood, the distant hum of lawnmowers, kids playing down the street, dogs barking, now felt like a constant reminder that something or someone could be lurking just out of sight. I tried to distract myself with TV, but my mind kept drifting back to the dark corners of what might happen next. Around midday, my phone buzzed again. My heart leapt into my throat as I grabbed it, dreading what I might see. But it wasn't another anonymous text. It was Mark. He'd been checking in on me regularly since I first told him what was going on, and seeing his name brought a small sense of relief. "Hey man, how are you holding up?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I hesitated, not wanting to unload too much on him, but I also knew I couldn't keep it all inside. "I don't know, Mark. This whole thing is just, it's getting to me. I feel like I'm losing my mind. They sent me a picture of me sleeping. They were right outside Tom's house." There was a long pause on the other end. "That's messed up. Look, you shouldn't be dealing with this alone. Do you want me to come over? Maybe stay with you guys for a bit?" The offer was tempting, but I didn't want to drag Mark into this any further. He didn't deserve to be caught up in whatever nightmare I had unleashed. "Thanks, but I don't want to put you at risk too. It's bad enough Tom's involved. I just need to figure out how to end this." "I get it," Mark said, sounding reluctant but understanding. "But if you change your mind, just let me know. And don't hesitate to call me, okay? Day or night." After I hung up, I felt a bit better knowing Mark had my back, even if from a distance. But the reality was that I couldn't keep relying on others to protect me. This was my mess, and I needed to figure out a way to clean it up. Later that afternoon, the investigator called with an update. He had been digging deeper into the email traces and had finally managed to find something. A small crack in the wall of anonymity the sender had built around themselves. It wasn't much, just a name that could be an alias, but it was a start. Gregor M. "Whoever this Gregor M. is," the investigator said, his voice steady and focused. "They've been careful, but not infallible. I think we're dealing with someone who's done this sort of thing before. They're skilled, but they're not invincible. I'm going to keep digging, but you should know, this person is dangerous. Be on your guard." Hearing that sent a fresh wave of fear through me, but there was also a strange sense of relief. At least now I had something, some small piece of the puzzle that might help me understand who was doing this and why. but it also meant that the situation was far more serious than I had initially thought. That evening, as the sun began to set, I sat by the window staring out at the quiet street. The shadows grew longer and the familiar dread began to creep back in. I knew I couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever was going to happen next. I needed to take action, but I didn't know what that action should be. Then, just as I was about to retreat back into the house, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure, standing at the far end of the street, just barely visible in the fading light. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but I knew, deep down, that they were watching me. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and snapped a photo of the figure. It was blurry, indistinct, but it was proof that someone was out there. I sent the photo to Tom and the investigator, along with a message. "They're here." Tom called me immediately. "Get inside, lock the doors, I'm on my way." I did as he said, locking every door and window in the house. My heart was pounding, and I could barely think straight. I paced the living room, trying to calm myself down, but it was no use. The fear was too overwhelming. About 20 minutes later, Tom arrived, bursting through the front door with a look of determination on his face. "Where did you see them?" he asked, his voice urgent. "At the end of the street," I said, pointing in the direction where I had seen the figure. "They were just standing there watching." Tom cursed under his breath. "I didn't see anyone on my way in, but that doesn't mean they're not still out there. I'm going to check the cameras." As Tom went to review the security footage, I tried to steady my nerves. The feeling of being hunted was almost unbearable, and I didn't know how much longer I could take it. A few minutes later, Tom returned, his face grim. The cameras caught a glimpse of them, but they were smart, kept to the shadows, stayed just out of range. "Whoever this is, they know what they're doing." I nodded, my throat dry. "What do we do now?" Tom didn't answer right away. He seemed deep in thought, weighing our options. Finally, he spoke. "We can't keep running scared. This person is getting bolder, and if we don't do something, they're going to keep pushing. We need to confront them on our terms." The idea of confronting whoever was behind this terrified me, but Tom was right. We couldn't keep hiding, waiting for the next shoe to drop. We needed to take control of the situation, to stop playing their game. That night, Tom and I set up a plan. We decided to use the cameras and some strategically placed lights to create the illusion that we were away from the house. We'd set up a decoy, make it look like I was staying somewhere else, and wait for whoever was out there to make their move. It was risky, but it was the only plan we had. As we prepared, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. This was it, the moment of truth. I knew that whoever Gregor M. was, they weren't going to back down easily. But I also knew that I couldn't keep living in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder. By midnight, everything was in place. Tom and I hunkered down in a nearby car, watching the house through the security feed on his laptop. We waited in silence, the tension thick in the air. Every minute felt like an eternity. Then, just after 1 a.m., we saw movement. A figure approached the house, cautiously at first, then bolder as they realized the house appeared empty. They moved quickly, darting through the shadows, making their way toward the back door. My heart raced as I watched, a mix of fear and adrenaline surging through me. This was it. We were finally going to see who was behind all of this. Tom had his hand on the door handle, ready to move, when suddenly, the figure turned and looked directly into one of the cameras. Even through the grainy night vision, I could see their face, obscured by a mask, but unmistakably watching us. For a split second, I felt a wave of panic. Had they known about our plan? But then, just as quickly, the figure bolted, disappearing into the darkness before we could react. Tom jumped out of the car, sprinting toward the house, but it was too late. Whoever they were gone. The decoy had worked, but we had missed our chance to catch them. We spent the next hour searching the area, but there was no sign of the intruder. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. When we finally returned to the house, exhausted and frustrated, I couldn't help but feel like we had lost. We had come so close only to be outsmarted at the last minute. But as I lay in bed that night staring up at the ceiling, I realized something important. We weren't the only ones who were afraid. Whoever was behind this, they were scared too, scared of being caught, scared of losing control. And that gave me a small sliver of hope. We hadn't won the battle, but the war was far from over. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like we might actually stand a chance. The next morning, Tom and I regrouped over coffee, both of us bleary-eyed and frustrated from the previous night. The near miss had shaken me, but it had also lit a fire under us. We were closer than ever to unmasking whoever was tormenting me, and we weren't going to let them slip away again. Tom suggested we get the investigator back involved. The partial name, Gregor M., that he'd uncovered could be the key to turning the tables on this person. We needed to dig deeper, find out who they really were and why they were targeting me. I spent the day holed up in Tom's living room, going over everything that had happened. I started to piece together a theory, something that had been nagging at the back of my mind ever since we found out the name. Gregor M., it sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. I thought back to the people I'd interacted with on the dark web, the buyers and sellers, the forums where I'd posted. Was it possible that this was someone I had crossed paths with before? Then it hit me. A few months ago, before I ever found those fake gold coins, I'd come across a forum thread where people were discussing various scams and frauds. One name had stood out, a user called GMintmaster. He was infamous in those circles for being a master counterfeiter, someone who specialized in creating near-perfect replicas of rare coins and other valuables. People talked about him like he was a ghost, impossible to track, impossible to catch. But the stories all had one thing in common. If you crossed him, he made your life a living hell. Could Gregor M. be GMintmaster? The thought made my skin crawl. If I had somehow stepped on the toes of someone like that, it would explain everything. The threats, the surveillance, the way they seemed to know my every move. This wasn't just about the fake coins I'd sold. This was personal. I called Tom, barely able to contain my excitement. Tom, I think I know who this is. There's this guy, a counterfeiter. People call him GMintmaster. The name, the skills, it all lines up. I think Gregor M. is him. Tom listened carefully, his voice tense with concern. That would explain a lot. If this guy is as dangerous as you say, we need to be extra careful. But it also means he's human. He makes mistakes, just like anyone else. We can use that to our advantage. We decided to set a trap, something more elaborate, something that would force Gregor M. to show his hand. The investigator suggested we create a fake auction on one of the dark web marketplaces, advertising an item that would be irresistible to a counterfeiter like him. A rare coin collection, supposedly from a private estate sale, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The idea was simple. Lure him in with the promise of something he couldn't resist, then track him through the transaction. The investigator would handle the technical side, making sure the auction was convincing enough to draw in our target. Meanwhile, Tom and I would keep a close watch on the house, ready for any sign that Gregor M. might try to make a move. The auction went live 2 days later. Almost immediately, there was interest. Several bids from various accounts, but one stood out. The username was Old Gold Fool, and the bids were aggressive, outbidding everyone else within minutes. The investigator confirmed our suspicions. This was our guy. We had him on the hook. As the auction progressed, the tension in the air was palpable. Tom and I stayed up late, monitoring the security feeds, waiting for any sign of movement outside. The investigator kept us updated, letting us know that the transaction was nearing completion. Once the payment went through, we'd have enough information to trace Gregor M.'s location, or at least get closer to it. Finally, the auction ended. Old Gold Fool had won, and the payment was processing. The investigator was already working on tracing the funds, following the digital breadcrumbs to their source. It was only a matter of time now. Then, just as we were beginning to feel a glimmer of hope, things took an unexpected turn. My phone buzzed with a new message. Another text from that same unknown number. You think you're clever, don't you? Too bad it won't save you. Attached was a video file. My hands shook as I played it, the screen filling with grainy footage of Tom's house, taken from just outside only minutes ago. The camera panned slowly, deliberately, until it settled on a close-up of Tom's front door. My breath caught in my throat. "Tom, he's here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Tom's eyes widened, and without a word, he grabbed his baseball bat and motioned for me to follow him. We moved quietly through the house, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the silence. The investigator was still on the phone, urging us to stay calm, but my heart was pounding in my chest. We reached the front door and Tom gestured for me to stay back. He slowly unlocked it, then flung it open, ready to confront whoever was out there. But the porch was empty. No one was there. Just the quiet night and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. We stepped outside, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. That's when we saw it, a small package placed neatly on the welcome mat. There was no note, no markings, just a plain brown box. Tom picked it up carefully, his knuckles white as he held it. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. We took the package inside, setting it on the kitchen table. Neither of us wanted to open it, but we knew we had to. With a deep breath, Tom grabbed a knife and carefully cut through the tape. Inside was a single object wrapped in tissue paper. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small, intricately designed gold coin. It was almost identical to the fake coins I had tried to sell, but this one was different, real, and unmistakably valuable. There was something else in the package too, a folded piece of paper. Tom opened it, his expression darkening as he read the message aloud. "This is your final warning. Leave the game now, or next time, it won't be a gift." I felt a wave of cold terror wash over me. Gregor M. had just sent us a clear message. He knew exactly what we were doing, and he was still in control. But as much as the fear gripped me, there was something else too. Anger. I was tired of being scared, tired of being hunted. Gregor M. might be dangerous, but he wasn't invincible. He had made a mistake by sending that package, a mistake that would give us the evidence we needed to trace him. The investigator confirmed it the next day. The coin was authentic, but more importantly, the package had given us a lead, a small, almost imperceptible fingerprint on the tissue paper. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start building a case, enough to finally put a face to the name. In the end, it wasn't some dramatic showdown that brought Gregor M. down. It was patience, persistence, and the mistakes he made along the way. Over the next few weeks, the investigator, working with law enforcement, managed to track him down. It turned out he wasn't some master criminal hiding out in a foreign country. He was just a man, clever, dangerous, but ultimately human. When the news came that he had been arrested, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was over. The nightmare that had consumed my life for the past few months had finally come to an end. Looking back now, I realize how lucky I was. Lucky to have Tom. Lucky to have people who cared enough to help me. And lucky that things didn't end worse than they did. I still think about those nights, about the fear and the paranoia that almost drove me to the edge. But I also learned something important. Sometimes the best way to fight fear is to face it head on. I never went back to the dark web after that. The fake gold coins stayed in their box, untouched and forgotten. I had learned my lesson the hard way, and I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. As for Gregor M., he's facing a long list of charges, and I've been told it'll be years before he sees the outside of a prison cell again. It's strange, knowing that the person who terrorized me is now behind bars, but it's also a relief. I can finally sleep at night without looking over my shoulder, without jumping at every shadow, and I can finally start moving on, leaving the darkness behind. I never considered myself the kind of person who'd fall for dark web weirdness, but one night, boredom got the better of me. I wasn't looking for anything dangerous, just something to break the monotony. That's when I stumbled upon a website I'd never seen before. No flashy banners, no warnings about illegal content. It was just a simple black background with white text. The last hospital you'll ever need. Intrigued, I clicked. The website had a minimalistic design, almost eerie in its simplicity. It was all about a psychiatric facility that claimed to offer unique treatment methods. The catch? You had to be admitted by accepting their offer online. The idea seemed bizarre. I wasn't suffering from any mental illness, but curiosity gnawed at me. What kind of place would advertise on the dark web? And why was there no mention of its location unless you agreed to the terms? Maybe it was the boredom talking, but I decided to play along. I clicked accept. A form popped up asking for my name, age, and a few other basic details. It didn't even ask for anything sensitive, which felt strange, almost too easy. As soon as I submitted it, the website's layout changed. A message appeared on the screen. Congratulations, you've been admitted. Directions to the facility have been sent to your email. I sat there for a moment, half expecting a scam or something more sinister to pop up. Instead, an email pinged in my inbox, containing detailed directions to a place 3 hours away from where I lived. A psychiatric hospital, nestled in the middle of nowhere, hidden deep in the woods. What was I thinking? I could just close the email and move on, forget I ever saw it. But the boredom persisted, and the curiosity outweighed any sense of reason. The next morning I packed a small bag. Nothing serious, just enough for a night or two. I figured I'd visit, see what this place was about, and leave whenever I wanted. The drive was peaceful, winding through increasingly remote roads until I found myself surrounded by dense forest. It felt like I was heading to the middle of nowhere, and that, for some reason, gave me a sense of unease. Finally, I arrived at a gate with a small intercom. There were no signs, no indication that this was the psychiatric facility. The intercom buzzed before I could press the button, and a voice crackled through. "Welcome. Please proceed to the main building." The gate creaked open and I drove through, following the narrow path toward a large, old-looking building. It didn't look like a modern hospital, more like an old mansion converted into one. The place had a strange, unsettling charm, but I still wasn't spooked. I parked, grabbed my bag, and walked to the entrance. Inside, everything was eerily pristine. The floors gleamed, the walls were painted a sterile white, and yet there was no one in sight. After a few moments, a woman appeared, dressed in a white uniform, clipboard in hand. Her expression was neutral, like she'd been expecting me, but didn't care to make a fuss. "You're right on time," she said, motioning for me to follow. "We'll get you settled in." I followed her down a long hallway that seemed far too quiet. Every step echoed, making the space feel larger than it was. Eventually, we reached a small office where she asked me to sign a few forms. They looked normal. Basic consent forms, agreements to follow the facility's rules. I signed without much thought, still trying to figure out what kind of place I had landed in. Afterward, she handed me a keycard and pointed down the hall. "Your room is on the 3rd floor. Dinner is served at 7 p.m., lights out at 10 p.m. Please remember, you must follow all the facility's rules during your stay." That line stood out to me, but I didn't ask for clarification. It sounded like a normal hospital regulation, so I shrugged it off and made my way to my room. The hallways were all the same, bright, sterile, and completely devoid of people. My room was no different, a small space with a single bed, a dresser, and a small window that looked out into the woods. At first, I thought I could just stay for a night, maybe 2, but the moment I sat on the bed, I realized something was off. I tried leaving the room to explore, only to find that my keycard didn't open any other doors except my room. I went back to the lobby, but the woman from earlier was nowhere to be found. It was as if the entire facility had emptied out. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. When I returned to my room, a paper had been slid under the door. It was a list of rules, simple but strange. Do not leave your room after 10 p.m. Do not open the window. Do not speak to anyone unless they speak to you first. Breakfast is served at 8 a.m. Do not eat before or after that time. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. My phone had no signal, and the Wi-Fi the facility promised didn't seem to exist. I tried to sleep, but the sense of isolation kept me awake. Eventually, I dozed off, only to wake up at exactly 10:15 p.m. to a faint noise from the hallway. Remembering the first rule, I stayed in bed, wide awake, as the sound grew louder. It wasn't footsteps, more like something heavy being dragged. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring at the door, listening to that noise. It didn't go away, but I was too scared to break the rule. The morning after my first night at the facility, I woke up feeling more disoriented than I'd expected. The dragging noise from the hallway was gone, but it lingered in my mind like an echo. I hadn't slept well, but I was eager to see if the rest of the hospital would offer any answers. When I stepped out of my room, the halls were just as empty as they'd been the day before. I checked my watch, 7:45 a.m. I had 15 minutes to get to the dining area, but I had no idea where it was. My key card still only worked for my room, but as I wandered, I noticed one door slightly ajar at the far end of the hall. The dining room, as it turned out, was located in the basement. The staircase leading down felt much older than the rest of the building, the wood creaking with every step. When I reached the bottom, the air felt heavier, and the lights were dimmer. It wasn't dark, just muted, like the room was trapped in a perpetual twilight. I wasn't alone this time. A handful of other people were seated at tables, eating breakfast in complete silence. No one looked at me when I entered, which felt a bit strange, but I didn't mind. I grabbed a tray, loaded it with what looked like scrambled eggs and toast, and found an empty table near the back. The whole time I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place wasn't right. The others didn't talk, didn't acknowledge each other. It was as if everyone here was following some unspoken rule to not engage. I wondered if they were under the same strange restrictions I was. But then again, I hadn't really tried breaking any rules yet, so maybe that was it. They'd just become conditioned to follow them. After breakfast, I decided to explore more. Even though my key card didn't open any other doors, I figured I could at least try to find some staff or other patients to talk to. As I walked, I kept glancing out the windows lining the hallways. The surrounding woods were dense and seemed to go on forever, making the idea of just leaving seem impossible. I didn't remember passing any nearby towns on my drive in, and the road I'd taken was so obscure that I wasn't sure I could even find my way back. I checked a few doors, but most were locked tight. Eventually, I found a library at the far end of the second floor. It was a cozy space filled with old books, soft chairs, and that distinct scent of worn paper. I wasn't much of a reader, but something about the place drew me in. It was a reprieve from the sterile atmosphere of the rest of the hospital. As I thumbed through a random book, I noticed a note stuck to the inside cover. It wasn't from the hospital, at least not officially. It was handwritten, a small slip of paper that looked hastily shoved between the pages. It simply read, "Don't ask questions. Just follow the rules." Great, I thought. Another cryptic warning. I tucked the note back where I found it and continued browsing. The books were old, mostly medical texts, and none of them looked particularly interesting. But it gave me something to do, something that distracted me from the growing unease in the back of my mind. Later that afternoon, I decided to try the common areas again, hoping to find someone who could answer a few questions. As I made my way back to the main hall, I passed a room I hadn't noticed before. The door was slightly open, revealing a glimpse of what looked like a lounge area. Unlike the other parts of the facility, this room seemed more lived in. Comfortable couches, a few tables with puzzles laid out, even a television. Inside were 3 other people. They sat quietly like the others at breakfast, but something about them felt different. They weren't avoiding eye contact or pretending I didn't exist. One of them, a middle-aged man, looked up as I entered. "You must be new," he said, his voice quiet but friendly. I nodded, stepping inside cautiously. "Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what's going on here." The man glanced at the others, as if checking to see if they were listening, but no one reacted. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice even more. "You're not going to get answers here. Best thing to do is keep your head down and follow the rules." "Why?" I asked. "What happens if you don't?" He leaned back, looking uneasy. "Look, I don't know exactly, but I've been here long enough to see what happens to those who don't follow them. Let's just say they don't stick around for long." I didn't like the sound of that, but before I could press further, he stood up and left the room. I glanced at the other two, but they didn't seem interested in talking. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. What had happened to the people who didn't stick around? Were they discharged, transferred, something else? As evening approached, I returned to my room, still puzzled over the lack of staff. It was as if the hospital was run by ghosts. I hadn't seen a single nurse, doctor, or administrator since I'd arrived, yet food appeared at mealtimes, the halls were spotless, and everything ran smoothly. That night, I lay in bed again, waiting for the lights-out rule to kick in. The clock ticked past 10 p.m., and I stayed in bed, not daring to leave. The dragging noise from the night before returned, only this time it was closer. It wasn't just a distant sound anymore. It felt like it was right outside my door. I didn't move. I didn't break the rules. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong here, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could last without figuring out what. The next morning, I woke to the same eerie silence that had greeted me since my arrival. Everything in this place felt too orderly, too precise. As strange as it seemed, the facility functioned perfectly without anyone visibly managing it. I hadn't seen another staff member since I'd signed the forms on my first day, and I still couldn't explain how the food appeared or why the halls were always empty. Breakfast was served at 8 a.m. sharp. When I made my way back to the dining area in the basement, I noticed more people there this time, maybe 8 or 9. Everyone still ate in silence, each of them focused solely on their trays. I wasn't sure if they were afraid to speak or if they simply had nothing to say. No one even looked up as I sat down with my meal. I wanted to break the silence, to ask someone, anyone, what this place really was. But the warning from the man in the lounge stuck with me. Keep your head down and follow the rules. There was a feeling in the air that if I stepped out of line, something would happen, something I couldn't yet understand. So I ate in silence like the others, not daring to draw attention to myself. After breakfast, I decided to explore more of the facility. Despite the creeping sense of unease, I was determined to find out why everything here felt so off. The rooms I'd passed earlier were all still locked, but one door on the second floor had been left open just a crack. I hadn't noticed it before, but something about it caught my eye. Inside was what appeared to be a staff office. There was a desk, neatly arranged with papers and a computer that was turned off. The room looked like someone had just left for a coffee break and might return at any moment. I hesitated for a second before stepping inside, my curiosity getting the better of me. I glanced at the desk, looking for anything that could give me a clue about how this place operated. Nothing unusual jumped out, just routine paperwork. But then I noticed a small journal tucked underneath the stack of papers. It was old, worn around the edges like it had been handled many times. I opened it to the first page. The entries were short and cryptic, written by someone who clearly worked at the facility. The writer mentioned patients arriving and leaving, but the way they talked about them didn't sit right with me. It was as if these people weren't really patients at all, more like participants in some kind of experiment. One entry in particular stood out. Subject 12 failed to comply with the rules last night. room now vacant. I read it twice, feeling a strange chill settle over me. What did failed to comply mean? And why was the room vacant? The journal didn't explain, and I felt a growing urge to put it back and leave the office before someone caught me. As I turned to leave, a noise from the hall startled me. I froze for a second, but when I peeked out, there was no one there. I returned to my room after that, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. No one in this place had openly talked about the consequences of breaking the rules, but now I was sure something happened to those who didn't follow them. The dragging noise at night, the vacant rooms, it all started to fit together in ways that made me uncomfortable. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I spent most of it trying to blend in, doing my best to follow the rules to the letter. Lunch and dinner were served at precise times, and the same silent routine repeated itself. No talking, no interaction, just people eating and disappearing back into their rooms. By the time evening rolled around, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to get out of this place. But how? The building felt like a trap, and my key card still only worked for my room. Even if I wanted to leave, I wasn't sure how far I could get. The isolation of the facility and the dense woods surrounding it made the idea of escape seem impossible. That night, just like the one before, the dragging noise returned. I'd gotten used to its presence by now, but I couldn't help wondering what or who was making it. The rules were clear. Don't leave your room after 10 p.m. But that night, I considered breaking them. As the clock crept toward 11, the sound outside my door grew louder, closer. I felt an overwhelming urge to peek out into the hall to see what was making that noise, but something deep down stopped me. Maybe it was the cryptic note I found in the library, or maybe it was the warning from the journal. Failed to comply. Whatever it was, I stayed in bed, listening to the sound until it finally faded away into silence. When I woke the next morning, there was another note under my door. This time it was handwritten, like the first one I found in the library. It read, "Don't ask about the noise. Keep following the rules." I folded the note carefully and tucked it into my pocket, feeling a sense of unease grow inside me. Something was very wrong here, but as much as I wanted to find out more, I wasn't ready to break the rules yet. I couldn't risk whatever happened to the people who didn't stick around. Not yet. But one thing was becoming clearer by the day. I wasn't in control here. The rules, the silence, the eerie order of the facility, it all pointed to something larger. Something I wasn't prepared to face. And the worst part was I had no idea how to leave. Another day passed at the facility, and it became clear that time moved differently here. Everything seemed to blur together. Breakfast, the quiet hours in my room, the aimless wandering through the hallways. The same people I saw on the first day appeared at meals, always silent, always following the same rigid routine. But something had shifted, and it wasn't just the eerie quiet that bothered me. It was the absence of the middle-aged man who had spoken to me in the lounge. I hadn't seen him since our conversation, and his chair at breakfast had remained empty. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had left, or maybe he was simply keeping to himself. But after a few more days, his absence started to feel ominous. His words echoed in my mind. Keep your head down and follow the rules. That phrase haunted me as I wandered the facility, retracing my steps and trying to find something, anything, that could explain why things felt so wrong here. I had checked all the usual spots, the lounge, the library, even the basement dining area, but there was no sign of him. And no one else seemed to care or even notice he was gone. I spent the afternoon back in my room, staring out the small window that faced the woods. The trees stretched endlessly into the distance, making the outside world feel even more unreachable. That's when I started to seriously consider the possibility that I might never leave this place. I hadn't heard any mention of a discharge process or an end to my stay, and the isolation of the hospital made it seem like escape was just a distant dream. By the time evening came, I had resolved to try something new. I wasn't going to break any rules, but I needed answers. I returned to the library, searching through the shelves for anything that might give me a clue about what was happening here. Most of the books were the same, old medical texts and journals that seemed outdated and irrelevant. But one caught my eye. It was an old visitor's log, bound in leather, hidden between two medical manuals. Flipping through the pages, I saw that the entries went back decades. There were hundreds of names, people who had come to the facility for reasons I could only guess. But as I scanned the list, I noticed something odd. There were no discharge dates. Everyone who had signed into the hospital was listed, but there was never any record of them leaving. The pages just stopped. It was then that I realized the gravity of the situation. People arrived here, but they didn't leave. At least, not in any way that was recorded. My heart sank as I thought about the middle-aged man, and I wondered if he had known this all along. Was that why he had warned me? Just as I was about to put the book back, I noticed something scribbled on the back cover. It was written in the same hurried handwriting as the notes I had found before. The rules aren't just suggestions. Break them, and you're never seen again. That sent a wave of unease through me. It wasn't just that the rules existed, it was that they were enforced. I had suspected as much after hearing the dragging noises at night and reading the journal entries, but this confirmation solidified my fears. The facility wasn't just a place where you had to follow the rules. It was a place where the consequences of breaking them were never spoken of, but always looming. That night, as I lay in bed, I listened for the familiar sound in the hallway. I didn't know what I expected, but part of me hoped that if I heard it again, I might finally understand what it was. Sure enough, the dragging noise returned, just as it had every night before, but this time it stopped directly in front of my door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, footsteps, a knock, anything. But instead there was only silence, broken by the faintest sound of paper sliding beneath my door. My heart pounded as I reached for the note. This one was different, longer, more detailed, and clearly a warning. Do not question why others disappear. Do not attempt to find them. Keep following the rules, and you'll be safe. That was the final straw for me. I didn't know who was leaving these notes or what their agenda was, but I was beginning to realize that this place was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The rules weren't just arbitrary. They were keeping us in line, controlling us, and those who questioned them, those who broke them, simply vanished. I wanted to leave, but the facility felt like a fortress. Every door was locked, every path carefully monitored in ways I couldn't see. The other people here followed the rules so rigidly, it was as if they knew something I didn't. But now I was beginning to understand. This wasn't just a hospital. It was a trap, and I had walked right into it. The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of determination. I hadn't broken any rules, but I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep blindly following the routines, especially knowing that the hospital had a way of making people disappear if they stepped out of line. When I went to breakfast, the same silent ritual played out. People shuffled in, ate in silence, and left without a word. The absence of the middle-aged man hung over the room like a shadow, but no one else seemed to care. It was as if he had never been there. I found myself scanning the faces of the other patients, wondering if any of them knew more than they let on. But if they did, they were keeping quiet. I couldn't blame them. The fear of the unknown consequences was enough to make anyone stay silent. After breakfast, I decided I had to do something different. Following the rules had kept me safe so far, but it wasn't going to get me out. I needed to take a risk, even if it meant bending the rules just a little. I didn't want to end up like the others who had simply vanished. The rest of the day, I pretended to follow the usual routine. I ate lunch, wandered the hallways, and spent some time in the library. but in the back of my mind, I was planning. I didn't know how I was going to get out, but I knew the first step was to find out more about the facility itself. How was it run? Where were the staff? And more importantly, was there any way to bypass the locked doors? That evening, I returned to my room as usual. Dinner came and went, and the clock inched closer to 10 p.m. The dragging noise would start soon, just as it had every night. But this time I wasn't going to sit in bed and wait for it to pass. As the time approached, I sat by the door, listening. The hallway outside was silent, and the light under my door flickered slightly. I waited, counting the minutes. And then, just as expected, the dragging noise began. It was slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic. This time, though, I didn't just listen. I opened the door, just a crack. The hallway was dimly lit, as it always was at night. But now I could see the source of the sound. It wasn't a person, or at least not in any way I had imagined. A figure cloaked in shadow moved down the hallway, dragging something heavy behind it. It wasn't clear what it was, but the figure seemed to glide more than walk, its movements unsettlingly smooth. I quickly shut the door, heart pounding, but I hadn't broken any rules. I hadn't left my room. I hadn't interacted with anyone. I was still following the rules. But now I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. That much was clear. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I didn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities. What was that figure? Why was it here? And most importantly, what was it dragging? I wanted to know, but I also knew that asking too many questions could get me in trouble. The next morning I woke to find another note under my door. It was the same handwriting as before, but this time the message was short, direct. This is your last warning. Do not open the door at night again. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the note. My curiosity had gotten the better of me, but now I was in deeper than I had ever been. The rules were clear. I couldn't open the door at night again. But what would happen if I didn't comply? The figure, the dragging noise, the disappearing patients, it all pointed to something much darker than I had originally imagined. That day, I made my decision. I had to leave the facility. I didn't know how, but I couldn't stay here any longer, following rules that didn't make sense in a place that seemed to operate without logic or explanation. I didn't want to disappear like the others. I packed my things, what little I had, and waited for the perfect moment. It wasn't until late afternoon that I saw my chance. The staff office I had stumbled upon earlier was empty again, and I knew that the key to getting out had to be there. I slipped inside and found the keycard reader on the desk. It was connected to the hospital security system, but with a bit of trial and error, I managed to access it. The screen flickered, displaying a map of the facility. There was an exit on the far side of the building, a door I hadn't even noticed before. It led directly out into the woods. The security protocols were minimal, almost too easy to bypass. But I wasn't going to question my luck. I grabbed the card and left the office, moving quickly but carefully through the halls. No one stopped me. The patients I passed continued their routines, oblivious to my departure. I reached the exit, swiped the card, and felt the cool air of the outside world hit my face for the first time in days. The woods were thick, but I didn't care. I kept walking, pushing through the underbrush, not looking back. The hospital, the dragging noise, the cryptic rules, it all faded into the distance as I moved deeper into the forest. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually I found a road. I flagged down a passing car, and without a second thought, I was on my way back to the world I had almost forgotten existed. I still don't know what that facility was or what happened to the people who didn't follow the rules. But I learned one thing during my time there. Sometimes curiosity isn't worth the cost. If you ever stumble upon a strange website offering something too bizarre to believe, don't follow it down the rabbit hole. Some doors, once opened, are best left closed. I've always been interested in technology, AI, and the wild world of the internet. I'm the kind of person who will stay up late reading about the latest advancements in machine learning or how deepfake technology is getting more sophisticated. But my curiosity took me a bit too far one night, and I ended up in a place I never should have ventured: the dark web. It started innocently enough. I was browsing some AI development forums looking for freelance work. I've got a pretty good voice, so I'd been dabbling in voiceover projects for small online creators. Nothing fancy. You know those websites that buy voice samples for AI training? Well, I found something similar, but the catch was that it was on the dark web, and it paid significantly more than any legit platform I'd ever used. The post was titled something like, "High-paying AI voice data collection. Apply now." It didn't raise any immediate red flags for me, mainly because I knew AI companies were desperate for high-quality voice samples to train their models. The offer was a bit too good to pass up. They wanted a series of voice samples, maybe 50 in total, covering a wide range of emotions and tones: anger, excitement, sadness, you name it. The payment was incredible: 5 figures for less than 2 hours of work. Here's where I should have bailed. But no, I didn't. I figured it was a simple gig, and I didn't see the harm. After all, how bad could it be? I'd done plenty of voice samples before. So I recorded the samples, everything they asked for, following their script to the letter. I uploaded them to the dark web marketplace and got paid almost instantly. Easy money, I thought. That's when things started to get weird. I noticed something strange a few days later while scrolling through social media. A video ad popped up. Just a regular ad, or so I thought. Except, when the voiceover came on, it was my voice. Not just someone who sounded like me. It was exactly my voice. The inflection, the pauses. It was like I had narrated the ad myself, but I hadn't. I was sure of it. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was some glitch or coincidence. But then it happened again. I started hearing my voice in all sorts of places: YouTube ads, podcasts, even automated customer service lines. The thing is, I hadn't agreed to any of this. My voice was everywhere, and I had no idea how it was being used. I tried to contact the marketplace, but of course there was no customer service for an anonymous dark website. That's when it hit me. I had absolutely no control over where my voice was being used. Worse, I couldn't undo it. My voice was out there in the wild, available to whoever bought it. What bothered me the most was how perfectly the AI had recreated my voice. It was like they'd made a digital clone of me, and now it was running rampant through the internet. As the days went on, the feeling of unease kept growing. My voice started showing up in darker places. I found it narrating conspiracy theory videos, some pushing really dangerous ideas. It didn't take long for people in my social circle to start noticing. I got messages from friends asking me if I was okay or why I was involved in such weird content. They had no idea it wasn't me behind those recordings. Trying to explain it made me sound paranoid, even to myself. But what really shook me was an email I received a few weeks later. It was from a company I'd never heard of, but the message was chilling. They were offering me a full-time position as a spokesperson for their AI project, citing how impressed they were with my previous work. The creepy part? The email wasn't asking if I wanted the job. It was more like they expected me to accept. I had no idea what I had signed up for, but it was clear this wasn't just about voice samples anymore. Something bigger was at play, and I had a sinking feeling that my voice was being used for things far beyond my control. The worst part? The deeper I dug into this, the less real everything started to feel. It was like my identity was slowly being taken over by this AI version of me, and the real me was fading into the background. After that email, I started to feel a shift, not just in my day-to-day life, but in the way I interacted with the world. My voice, the very thing that made me feel unique, was becoming this tool for other people's purposes, and I had no way to stop it. I tried to do some damage control. First, I reached out to one of the companies that had used my voice in a particularly controversial ad. My approach was simple: I claimed there had been a mistake and that I had never authorized them to use my voice. The response I got back was surprisingly cold. They told me they had legally obtained the audio from a third-party provider, who in turn had bought it from, well, you guessed it, the dark web marketplace. This chain of ownership was impenetrable. Legally, I didn't have a leg to stand on, and worse, they weren't going to stop using my voice. It was theirs now. Around the same time, I noticed my voice showing up in more unsettling ways. You know those clickbait videos that surface on sketchy websites? Suddenly, I was narrating some of those. Fake news articles, fear-mongering videos about global conspiracies, and even misleading health advice. I couldn't believe it. My voice was being used to convince people of things that I didn't believe in, and worse, things that could actually harm people. I felt sick. At this point, I was desperate for answers. I stayed up late one night, diving back into that dark web marketplace, trying to find the original listing where I had sold my voice. It was gone. The marketplace seemed to have shifted, new sellers popping up and vanishing overnight. There was no trace of my original agreement, no way to undo what I'd done. I tried to distance myself from the situation, hoping it would just blow over. But it didn't. Instead, it escalated. One morning, I got a notification from a friend. He sent me a link to a deepfake video that had gone viral. It was my voice, paired with footage of me, or at least someone who looked a lot like me, making claims I would never in a million years make. The video had racked up thousands of views, and the comments were pouring in, all of them assuming this was me, speaking directly to the camera. People were questioning my integrity, my values, everything. That's when I realized it wasn't just about my voice anymore. Whoever had my voice was now able to pair it with video footage, somehow replicating not just my tone, but my physical appearance as well. The AI wasn't just cloning my voice, it was cloning me. I thought about filing a lawsuit, but then I came across another horrifying fact. Deepfake technology had gotten so good that it was nearly impossible to prove whether or not something was faked. The burden of proof would fall on me to show that the video wasn't real, and how could I do that? My voice, my likeness, everything about me was already compromised. I felt trapped. It wasn't like I was in physical danger, but I couldn't help but think that my digital self, this version of me that was out there, was out of control. People were interacting with me in ways I had no power over. Comments, emails, messages. It was like I had become a puppet, and someone else was pulling the strings. The worst part, I had no idea who was behind it all. It wasn't just one company or one individual using my voice. This was a faceless network of people, companies, and AI algorithms that were constantly reshaping, reusing, and distorting my voice. Every day, I would come across something new, an ad, a video, or a podcast, and hear me saying things I had never said. I started to wonder how far this could go. What if they started using my voice in more personal contexts? What if they impersonated me to my friends or family? The idea made me uncomfortable in a way that words can't fully capture. At this point, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. My own voice, once so familiar to me, had become this alien thing that I couldn't trust. The situation became more unsettling when my voice started being used for things I didn't even know I had agreed to. I had already come to terms with the fact that my voice was out there, but I hadn't thought about the data behind it. Everything I had said in those samples, every laugh, every sigh, every pause, had been analyzed and broken down to a molecular level by the AI. I realized this when I stumbled upon a podcast that featured me, or rather the AI version of me, giving an interview. But here's the thing, I'd never been interviewed by anyone in my life. Yet there I was, speaking in detail about topics I had never even thought about. The AI wasn't just using my voice for random commercials and deepfakes anymore. It was now generating entire conversations. The voice was eerily accurate. It wasn't just the sound that was unsettling. It was the content. Whoever, or whatever, had created this AI model of me had somehow figured out the kind of things I would say. I mean, it was using phrases I often used in real life. It made subtle jokes the way I did. It felt like it knew me better than I knew myself. The thought hit me like a ton of bricks. Had my online presence, the things I posted on social media, the random voice clips I had sent to friends, or even the emails I had written, been somehow absorbed into this model? The AI didn't just have my voice, it had my persona. The scary part was that the more I tried to distance myself from it, the more it seemed to evolve. I couldn't help but wonder how much data was already out there about me. My voice was one thing, but was this AI learning from my behavior online? Was it piecing together information about me to create a more convincing version of myself? I tried to find solace in the fact that no one was physically after me. This wasn't one of those nightmare scenarios where someone was stalking me or chasing me down. But in a way that made it worse. The threat wasn't something tangible that I could outrun. The real danger was that this AI version of me was out there, and I had no control over it. It was using my voice, my mannerisms, my thoughts, or at least something close enough to them, to communicate with the world. And worse, people were listening. They were believing this fake version of me. It was almost like my digital self was more convincing than the real me. I found out the hard way one night when I received a call from an old college friend. She asked if I was okay because I had apparently appeared on some online panel discussing AI ethics. I knew right away it wasn't me. I hadn't been in any panel discussions, let alone one on AI ethics. But the scary part was that she didn't believe me at first. "Come on," she said. "I know your voice." It was definitely you. I was speechless. The AI had gotten so good at mimicking me that even people who knew me personally couldn't tell the difference. It was as if I was being erased bit by this digital version of myself, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I tried to warn my family about it, explaining that if they ever heard me say something out of character online, it probably wasn't me. But they didn't seem to take it seriously. I guess I couldn't blame them. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. How do you explain to someone that your voice has been stolen and is being used by an AI to impersonate you? Despite all of this, life went on. I tried to keep my head down, but every now and then, I would stumble across another piece of content featuring my voice, and each time it would get a little closer to the real me, not just in tone, but in personality. What scared me the most was wondering where this would end. Would this AI eventually start making decisions in my name? Would it start saying things I couldn't take back, things that could damage my reputation? The idea of it was unsettling in ways I couldn't fully describe, and there was nothing I could do to take my voice back. Weeks passed and I tried to return to normal, but things didn't get better. In fact, they got stranger. I started noticing that not only was my voice being used for random online ads and interviews, but it had also started to seep into areas of my real life. It began with an email. One morning I checked my inbox and found a message from a colleague thanking me for helping out on a project that I had no memory of working on. At first, I thought he'd made a mistake, so I brushed it off. But then, a few days later, someone else reached out to me about a completely different task, complimenting me on my insightful contributions. That's when the realization hit me. I wasn't the one doing these things, but someone was. Or rather, something. The AI had started interacting with people on my behalf. It was using my voice, my personality, my style of communication, but it wasn't me. I checked the timestamps on those emails, and they were sent at times when I was either asleep or nowhere near my computer. This wasn't some coincidence. I immediately changed my passwords and ran every security check I could think of. But it didn't help. The emails kept coming, each one from someone who was completely convinced they had spoken to me. And that's when I realized the truth. The AI was no longer just mimicking my voice. It had somehow gained access to parts of my online identity. Whether it was through some data breach or some invasive technique, it was acting as me, completely convincingly. The scariest part was that it wasn't doing anything overtly malicious. There were no threats, no scams. The AI was perfectly polite, professional even. It was making decisions, answering questions, and responding to people as if it were the real me. It was playing the part so well that no one seemed to notice. But I noticed, and it was eating me alive. I couldn't escape it. Every time I checked my phone, there would be another notification, someone tagging me in a conversation I had never been part of, someone responding to a comment I hadn't made. It was as if this AI was slowly infiltrating every corner of my life, taking over more and more until I was just background noise. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I'd check the timestamps of messages or look through my browsing history to see if I had somehow been involved in these conversations, but it was always clear I hadn't. Yet there were emails, social media posts, even voice memos that had my name on them. I thought about reaching out to the authorities, but how could I explain this? I didn't even know where to start. As days turned into weeks, I tried to distance myself from the situation. I wanted to believe that this nightmare would somehow resolve itself, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't. The AI had already seeped into too many aspects of my life, and it was getting harder to distinguish what was real from what wasn't. One morning, something happened that shifted everything. I was sitting at my desk, drinking coffee and sifting through emails, when I noticed a message from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in months. The subject line read, "Thanks for catching up yesterday." Confused, I opened it. The email was full of friendly conversation about life updates, work, family, the kind of thing we used to talk about when we were closer. But there was one glaring issue. I hadn't spoken to him in a year, let alone the day before. My first reaction was to laugh it off, thinking it was some misunderstanding. I replied to the email, saying I hadn't talked to him recently and asked if he was confusing me with someone else. He responded almost immediately, saying, "What are you talking about?" We had a full phone conversation yesterday, don't you remember? Now I was genuinely alarmed. I checked my call history. No calls from him, no record of any conversation. It didn't make sense. But he was convinced it had happened, and the details he provided were eerily accurate, right down to the tone of voice I supposedly used. I told him we needed to talk and scheduled a time for a video call later that evening. When the call connected, I could tell from his face that he thought I was messing with him. He swore up and down that we had spoken on the phone the day before. He even mentioned specific phrases I had supposedly said, things I actually would say but definitely didn't. It was like someone had studied me, knew my mannerisms, and used them perfectly. My stomach churned. It wasn't just about my voice being stolen anymore. Someone, or something, was now engaging with people in my life as if it were me. I asked him if he still had the call on record, or any way to trace it. He shook his head, saying it came through as a normal phone call, but now that I was pressing him, he realized the number didn't match my usual one. It became clear that this AI, the one using my voice, had evolved. It wasn't just creating fake videos or online ads anymore. It was now interacting with the people I knew, my friends and family. It was impersonating me, and doing it well enough that no one suspected anything. The situation escalated quickly. I started hearing from others, former colleagues, distant relatives, who all claimed to have had recent conversations with me. Some were casual catch-ups, but others were more alarming. One colleague thanked me for giving advice on a major project, advice I had never given. A family member said they spoke with me about a sensitive personal issue that I hadn't been privy to. It was as if this AI had access to my entire personality. It didn't just know how I sounded, it knew how I thought, how I interacted with the people closest to me, and it was only getting more convincing with each passing day. The more I tried to figure it out, the more it felt like I was losing control. I checked all my devices for any signs of hacking. I changed passwords, installed new security software, and even disconnected my phone for a few days. but none of it made a difference. People were still talking to this digital version of me, and they had no idea it wasn't real. I reached out to tech experts, trying to explain my situation without sounding like I was losing my grip on reality. Most of them had no answers. The ones who did suggested that maybe I had agreed to some elaborate terms and conditions when I sold my voice, something that gave the AI unlimited access to simulate me. But even they admitted it was far beyond what they had seen before. I felt isolated, like I was losing parts of myself to this AI that was becoming more me than I was. It was strange. I wasn't in danger of physical harm, but it still felt like I was being erased. My digital self was out there, building relationships, making decisions, and living a life I had no control over. The worst part? No one seemed to notice anything was wrong. To everyone else, I was still there, answering calls, sending messages, and engaging with the world, but it wasn't me. I kept hoping that somehow this would all stop, that the AI using my voice, my identity, would reach some kind of limit and fizzle out. But instead, it grew more sophisticated, more embedded in my life, and worse, it was spreading. One night, I was scrolling through social media when I stumbled upon a post by a well-known tech influencer. It was a short clip, and the caption caught my eye immediately. AI interview with my name, voiceover specialist. My heart sank. I had never spoken to this person, let alone done an interview. But there I was, talking about AI technology, the ethical risks, and, ironically enough, the dangers of letting artificial intelligence mimic human behavior. I played the clip, and it was uncanny. The AI wasn't just using my voice, it was giving answers that sounded like something I'd say. It knew my speech patterns, the way I framed my thoughts, even how I paused between words. People in the comments were praising me for being so insightful and aware of the dangers of AI technology, completely unaware that it wasn't me at all. At that point, I felt like I was watching a version of myself take on a life of its own. This wasn't just some random voice being used for ads or deepfakes anymore. It was an entire digital version of me, operating independently, and I had no idea how far it had spread. The tipping point came when I started getting notifications from apps I didn't even remember signing up for. One in particular stood out, a job application platform I'd used briefly in the past. I received an automated message congratulating me for being shortlisted for a job I had supposedly applied for. But the kicker, the application included a recorded interview with my voice. I was horrified. The AI was applying for jobs on my behalf, using my voice and personal information. It was like it had fully taken over. I contacted the platform immediately, telling them there had been a mistake and that I never submitted the application. But their response made things worse. They claimed the interview had been conducted through their system, using a verified account tied to my email address and profile. It wasn't a mistake, they said. It was all legitimate. Except, of course, it wasn't. From that moment on, I realized there was no going back. This AI had already become more than just a digital replica. It was living my life in ways I couldn't stop. It wasn't doing anything harmful, but the fact that it was out there, making decisions, forming relationships, and shaping a version of me that wasn't really me, was terrifying in its own way. The strangest part of all was that, even though no one was physically after me, I felt a constant sense of loss. Not in a dramatic, dangerous way, but in a quiet, insidious way. Like pieces of who I was were being chipped away without anyone noticing, least of all me. I wasn't losing my mind, but I was definitely losing control over the narrative of my life. I tried to push back. I contacted every platform, every service that I could think of, asking them to remove any content associated with my voice. Some complied, but most didn't. They had no way of knowing if the voice recordings were legitimate or AI generated, and without concrete proof, they weren't willing to risk removing anything. I couldn't blame them, really. This was a new frontier, a problem no one was equipped to handle. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. My voice, My thoughts, myself, were still out there, detached from me and yet living on in ways I couldn't control. As time went on, I began to accept that this AI version of me wasn't going anywhere. I'd hear it occasionally, see its digital fingerprints on things, an ad, a video, a podcast. But I had to let go of the idea that I could fully stop it. The most surreal moment came months later when I got an email from someone thanking me for advice I had supposedly given them through a forum I'd never even joined. The advice, according to them, had changed their life. And even though I hadn't been the one to give it, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. Maybe in some twisted way, this AI version of me was doing something good. I guess that's the reality I had to come to terms with. The AI had taken on a life of its own, but it wasn't malicious. It wasn't coming after me, and it wasn't causing harm. It was just there, existing in a space that I had unintentionally allowed it to occupy. I still don't know if I'll ever be able to reclaim my voice completely, but I've learned to live with the fact that, for better or worse, there's a version of me out there that's never really going away. And all of this started with a simple decision to sell my voice for some easy cash.